When I was 80, my late husband's house started feeling different. Not all at once, but in a slow, creeping way that I tried to ignore. Linda, my daughter, had been on me about moving my bedroom downstairs for a while, and after I slipped on the stairs one morning, she insisted. We set up a small bed in the old dining room, right by the window looking out to the street. My bedroom upstairs stayed empty except for the old furniture, the closet full of clothes, and the pictures on the wall. Linda came over every day now, usually around noon, always with a new pillbox, or a bag of groceries, or her hands on her hips telling me not to try lifting the laundry basket again. At first, I didn't think much about the house feeling different. But some evenings, I'd sit in my new bedroom, sorting out my little TV tray dinner, and I'd hear these creaks from above. It wasn't just the old radiator knocking or the boards popping when it got cold. It sounded heavier. Sometimes it was a thud, or what could have been a shoe scraping the floor. I'd listen for a while, holding my breath, and then I'd decide it was nothing. When I mentioned it to Linda, she just shrugged and said, "It's an old house, Mom. It settles. Don't let it scare you." But that didn't explain why I'd find the upstairs door open when I could swear we'd closed it together. Linda would lock it every night, even show me the latch, and the next morning I'd find it just barely ajar, letting in a draft. I'd close it and tell myself I was getting forgetful. Then food started disappearing from the fridge. Not whole meals, just pieces. A sandwich missing from its bag, a yogurt gone. I kept a little notepad now, writing down what I bought and what I ate. One morning, the leftover soup from dinner was gone. I called Linda about it, and she told me, "Mom, you probably ate it and just don't remember. You need to write this stuff down." I almost told her I already was, but it didn't seem worth the trouble. I'd open the fridge and stare at the empty spot where the food should be, and I'd stand there, staring, thinking maybe I'd already eaten. Maybe I was getting worse. Sometimes, the smallest things unsettled me the most. Like when I found the sugar canister on the wrong side of the counter, or a kitchen chair pushed out just a little farther than I would leave it. Once, the old clock radio upstairs was playing static in the morning, even though I knew we hadn't turned it on in weeks. I unplugged it and set it back in the closet. Linda started watching me more closely after that. She'd check the pill bottles to make sure I hadn't missed a dose. She'd call me in the evening and ask what I'd had for supper, how I was feeling, if I'd been out to the garden. Sometimes I'd tell her about the noises or the things moved out of place, but she'd just pat my hand and say, "You're just tired, Mom. I'll look around upstairs next time I'm over." But I could see the worry in her face. She was afraid I was getting worse, and maybe I was. I started asking myself, did I really close that door? Or was it just my imagination? Did I eat that soup and forget? Was I losing my mind faster than I thought? The nights grew longer and quieter, except for those sounds upstairs. They got more regular, always after I'd turned out the light. Footsteps moved from one end of the room above me to the other, slow and steady, sometimes pausing like someone was listening for me. I'd lie awake, heart pounding, staring at the shadow on the wall. Sometimes I'd get up and walk to the foot of the stairs, but I never went up. My knees wouldn't let me, and I didn't want to fall. I called Linda, sometimes late, just to tell her. She'd sigh and tell me, "It's just the pipes, Mom, or maybe the wind. Don't worry about it. I'll check tomorrow." Strange things started appearing around the house. One morning I found a coffee mug in my sink that wasn't mine. Thick white ceramic, a chipped rim, with some old company logo faded on the side. I stared at it for a long time, trying to remember if Linda had brought it. When she arrived, I asked her, and she just shook her head. "You probably bought it at Goodwill and forgot, Mom. Let's just wash it." I threw it in the garbage, but found it back on the counter a day later. A jacket showed up in the hall closet. Not a woman's jacket either. Heavy, brown canvas, pockets worn out, sleeves too long for me. Linda found it and asked, "When did you get this, Mom?" I had no answer. She frowned, told me I must have picked it up at the store by mistake, and stuffed it in the donation bag. That night, I saw it hanging by the back door. Sometimes I'd find old grocery receipts in the trash with items I never bought. Once I opened the pantry and saw a can of beans I never purchased, sitting right in the front. Linda started getting frustrated with me, but in a gentle way. She'd walk around the house, touching things, straightening up, asking me, "Are you sure you didn't buy these? Are you sure you're not just forgetting?" I had no answers. I could see she was worried, and that made me worry more. The notepad by the fridge filled up with lists I didn't remember making. I'd go to the sink and just stand there, trying to remember if I'd washed the dishes, or if I'd eaten, or if I'd just stood in that spot the night before. My confidence in my own memory crumbled. The noises above grew louder. Items moved and appeared. Food disappeared. And all the little things Linda said where nothing kept piling up until I stopped trusting myself at all. I wondered if I was losing my mind faster than anyone realized. Linda came over one cold winter morning, earlier than usual, carrying her coat and a plastic bag with groceries. She looked tired and worried and didn't say much at first. After putting the milk in the fridge, she went straight upstairs, saying she wanted to check something. I waited in the kitchen, sitting at the little table, listening to her footsteps above me. A few minutes later, I heard her running back down. She was pale, shaking, her hands gripping the banister. "Mom, get your coat," she said, voice tight. "We're going to the doctor right now." She wouldn't look me in the eye as she helped me with my shoes. I wanted to ask her what was wrong, but her face stopped me. She walked me out to the car and kept glancing back at the house as we drove away. Instead of turning toward the clinic, she drove straight to her own house. She didn't let me out of the car until she had checked the windows and locked the doors behind us. Once we were inside, she pulled the phone from her purse and called the police. She gave our address, told them we weren't home, and said something had happened. I stood by the window, clutching the edge of the kitchen sink, watching for the patrol cars. It was only a few minutes before they pulled up, lights flashing but no sirens, and officers got out with flashlights and weapons. They moved in and out of the shadows, heading up the walkway and through the front door. Linda gripped my hand so tightly I could feel her nails digging into my palm. She wouldn't answer my questions, just kept watching the road. We waited together in her kitchen as the minutes ticked by. The patrol cars stayed outside my house, and more officers arrived. I watched them circle the yard, shining flashlights up at the windows, then disappearing inside. Linda finally made me sit down at her kitchen table, but she didn't let go of my hand. The whole time she was silent, except for the sound of her breathing and the hum of the refrigerator. I tried to keep still, to hold back questions, but the waiting made my chest feel tight. I could see the neighbors across the street standing in their doorways, watching the scene unfold, but nobody came over to ask what had happened. After what felt like hours, a police officer knocked on Linda's door. She went outside to talk to him, leaving me sitting alone, staring at my hands. Linda came back inside, her face white and her lips pressed thin. She closed the door behind her and sat across from me, searching for words. Finally, she said, "They found someone upstairs." My stomach dropped. She explained in a low voice that a man had been living in my upstairs bedroom, using blankets and taking food from the kitchen at night. He'd gotten in through a basement window I never used. The police said he had been there for at least 3 months, making a living space out of my missing things and things he brought in from outside. My lost coffee mug, the jacket, the strange receipts. They were all his. Linda told me the officers found his blankets and a stack of empty cans, some of my old clothes, and even a little camp stove he'd used when he couldn't risk coming downstairs. They believed he only came down while I was asleep, never turning on lights or making noise if he could help it. The light Linda saw that morning had come from a lamp plugged into an extension cord he'd run out the back window to a socket on the porch. When the police found him, he didn't fight or try to escape. He just sat on the edge of the bed, staring at the floor. He was middle-aged, dirty, and thin, and he told them he thought the house was empty when he first entered. He'd been living on the street before that, and said he didn't want to scare anyone. He kept saying, "I thought nobody lived here." He was arrested for breaking and entering, and taken away in the back of a squad car. After that, Linda insisted on changing all the locks. She brought in a company to install a security system and new deadbolts on every door and window. The basement window was bricked over, and Linda started checking the house top to bottom every time she visited. She said she couldn't trust the old locks anymore, and she was furious with herself for not believing me sooner. I started noticing just how many details I couldn't remember. How many nights I must have crossed paths with that man, maybe only a wall away, maybe even closer. Linda said my memory problems had actually kept me from panicking. I hadn't remembered enough to be afraid at the right moments, which probably kept me from making things worse. The police said the man had probably been watching the house for weeks before moving in, waiting for a time when it seemed empty or safe. He'd watched my routines, learned when I was alone and asleep, and slowly moved his things inside. Linda said it wasn't my fault, but I kept thinking about all the little signs I'd ignored or explained away. After a few weeks, Linda told me she couldn't stand the thought of me staying alone in that house. She helped me pack a suitcase, and I moved to an assisted living home on the other side of town. The first few nights, I woke up every hour, thinking I heard someone moving in the next room. Now, I sit in a small, bright room that smells of soap and fresh paint. Linda visits me every day. Sometimes we talk about what happened, but mostly we don't. The police said I wasn't the first person this had happened to, and probably wouldn't be the last. Sometimes when I watch the other residents shuffle by in the hall, I wonder how many have stories like mine. Strange noises, missing food, doors left ajar, and were told by their children or caretakers that it was just their imagination. Being believed turned out to be more important than being right. I learned that the scariest part of all wasn't the man in the house. It was realizing how invisible and vulnerable I had become, even in my own home. So when I was 24, I moved into a new apartment complex in Austin for my final semester. The place was off a busy road, but my unit was tucked around the side of the building, second floor. The stairs were carpeted and the outside lights always worked. It made me feel pretty safe. There were security cameras at every entrance, even at the end of the hallway, so my mom had less reason to worry when she helped me move in. She kept telling me to text her after dark, and I always said yes, even if sometimes I forgot. That evening, I was alone. My classes didn't start for a few more days, so I was just unpacking and setting up my desk by the window. I decided to check my mailbox before it got late. The mailroom was in the main lobby, a short walk down the outside walkway, through 2 glass doors. I remember the lobby floor was always a little sticky from people dragging in soda cups, and there was a fake plant that dropped plastic leaves sometimes. I checked my mail, mostly flyers and a bill from my old apartment. Nothing urgent. When I got back, I dropped the mail on the kitchen counter and saw a notification on my phone. It was Jake, my friend from my undergrad, wanting to FaceTime. I answered, set the phone on speaker, and started moving boxes around. We joked about my new adult apartment, and he made fun of the ugly couch I bought from Facebook Marketplace. I was laughing at something he said when I knocked my phone off the counter. It bounced once and slid under my bed. I groaned and got down to look for it. My bed was low, just a mattress on a metal frame, so I had to get all the way onto my hands and knees. The wood floor was cold. I lifted the bed skirt, squinting to see in the dim space under there. I reached one arm in, feeling around for the phone by touch, brushing past a pair of shoes and an old hoodie. My fingers finally hit the edge of the phone case. As I grabbed it, I saw something out of place, a sneaker, but not mine. My eyes adjusted, and I realized there was a shape taking up almost half the space under the bed. It took a few seconds to make sense of it, but then I saw his back, a man curled on his side, pressed against the wall under my bed. His face was turned away, shoulders hunched, legs pulled tight. I could see his t-shirt, gray, dirty, wrinkled like he'd been there a long time. There was a scuffed duffel bag by his knees. He was breathing, slow, barely moving. I froze, arms still stretched out, heart pounding. For a second I wondered if I was hallucinating, if it was just a trick of the light. But then the man shifted, very slightly, like he was getting comfortable. I jerked my hand back, gripping my phone. I tried not to make a sound. It was like he hadn't seen me yet. He was just lying there, facing the wall, completely still except for the rise and fall of his chest. I stared, trying to process what I was seeing. The dirty sneakers, the greasy hair sticking out from his neck, the duffel with a cracked zipper. I backed away slowly, letting the bed skirt fall. My mind was racing with questions. How did he get in? How long had he been here? Was he armed? Did he know I was home? The only thing I could think to do was get up, as quietly as possible. My hand shook as I picked up my phone and stood, trying to act like nothing was wrong. I forced myself to keep talking to Jake, pretending the call hadn't dropped. My mouth felt dry. I tried to sound normal. "Hey, can you hang on? I think I'm gonna take a shower before it gets too late," I said, keeping my voice steady, hoping the man under my bed wouldn't realize I'd seen him. I made myself move slowly, not rushing. I crossed the room, careful not to look back at the bed. My keys and wallet were on the dresser. I didn't grab them. I needed to get to the bathroom first. The hallway was empty. The only sound was the faint hum of my fridge and Jake's voice on the phone, rambling about something I couldn't focus on. I stepped into the bathroom and shut the door behind me. I clicked the lock, the sound sharp in the quiet. My hands were trembling as I leaned against the counter, trying to keep breathing steady. I turned the shower on, twisting the handle hard until the water was rushing loud, covering any noise I might make. My phone screen was smudged from my grip. The man under my bed hadn't moved during the whole time I was in the room. I pictured him there, still, silent, like he was waiting for something. I wondered if he knew I'd seen him. I wondered what would happen if he realized I was calling for help or trying to escape. I looked at the tiny window above the tub. It was too small for anyone to fit through, just a slit of glass with dust in the corners. The only other way out was the front door, past the bedroom. I pressed my forehead to the cool mirror, listening for any sound over the running water. My heart was thudding so loud I thought he could hear it. My mind raced with possibilities. Maybe he was just a homeless guy looking for a place to sleep. Maybe he was waiting for me to leave so he could steal something. Or maybe it was worse. I had no idea. I looked down and realized I was still gripping my phone so tightly my knuckles hurt. The call with Jake was still connected. I took a deep breath, trying to decide what to do next. The water beat against the shower tiles, echoing in the small room, and I stood perfectly still, staring at the locked door, waiting to hear the floor creak outside. The bathroom was small, but the window was right above the tub, and it slid open if you pressed hard enough. The fire escape outside was old but solid. I remembered noticing it when the leasing agent showed me the unit. I tried to move slow, making as little noise as I could, and kept the shower running to cover any sound. My hands fumbled with the window lock. When it slid open, cold air rushed in. I slipped one leg out, then the other, gripping the edge. My feet hit the metal grating, the shock vibrating up my legs. The fire escape was narrow, but I crouched low and eased down the stairs, holding onto the rusty railing. Below, the parking lot was mostly empty except for a few scattered cars. I moved between them, ducking low, and kept checking over my shoulder. The whole time, I clutched my phone. My breath was shaking, but I forced myself to keep moving, not look back up at my window. Once I found a spot behind a dark SUV, I crouched down, hit the emergency call, and pressed the phone to my ear. The 911 dispatcher answered, voice calm, asking my name and location. I gave the address, told her there was a man in my apartment, hiding under my bed, possibly armed. She told me to stay hidden, to keep the line open. I glanced up at my bathroom window, waiting for any sign of movement. I texted Jake, typing fast, hands still shaking. I told him exactly where I was, that I needed him, that this was serious, and to come now. He responded in seconds, saying he was 5 minutes away. I barely read the rest. My eyes kept flicking to the entrance, to my window, to the stairwell. The dispatcher kept talking, asking me to describe the man, to tell her what I could see. I told her everything I remembered: dirty t-shirt, gray duffel, sneakers that weren't mine. She said officers were already close. It felt like an hour before anything happened, but it couldn't have been more than a few minutes. My phone buzzed again. Jake. Almost there. I kept watching my window, waiting for a shadow or any sign the man had realized I was gone. Nothing moved. My heart felt like it would never slow down. I stayed behind the SUV until I saw the first police cruiser pull into the lot, red and blue lights silent but spinning. Then another pulled up behind it, headlights cutting across the pavement. Jake's car turned in just after them. He jumped out, jogging to the edge of the lot, looking around until he spotted me crouched behind the SUV. I waved him over but motioned for him to stay low. We stayed together, watching as two officers stepped out, vests on, hands near their holsters. I got up and moved quickly to meet them at the building's lobby entrance. Jake followed close behind. Inside, I pointed up to my apartment, trying to keep my voice steady. Second floor, last door on the left. The officers nodded, moving quickly but controlled. One radioed something in while the other drew his weapon. They told us to stay put in the lobby and not to follow. Jake and I waited by the glass door, able to see the stairwell but not my unit. The dispatcher was still in my ear, telling me to stay on the line, to let her know if I saw anything or if the man came out. I stared at the stairwell, waiting. We heard shouting from above, the sound muffled through the concrete and drywall. "Austin police, come out with your hands up." Then a crash, something heavy hitting the floor. Another shout. Jake squeezed my arm, silent. The seconds stretched. It was impossible to tell what was happening, if the man had run, if he was fighting, if he had a weapon. The noise above continued, then stopped all at once. I stared at the stairwell, not breathing, waiting for footsteps. The door to the hallway banged open. An officer came down, breathing hard, and found us by the entrance. He looked me over, then nodded. "We've got him in custody. Are you okay?" I nodded. My voice didn't want to work at first. He said they'd found the man standing right outside the bathroom door, kitchen knife in hand. He had been waiting, listening for the shower to stop. "If you hadn't left when you did," the officer said, "he would have been right there." Jake and I stood together, watching as two more officers escorted the man out in handcuffs. He looked smaller in the hallway light, face pale, eyes wild. He kept glancing at the floor, mumbling something none of us could understand. His clothes were stained with dirt and sweat, and the duffel bag was slung over his shoulder. They led him out, past us, and into the back of a cruiser. Jake stayed beside me, not saying anything, just watching. I followed the officers back to my apartment. The door lock was splintered, broken. They asked me if I'd noticed it before. I told them it was fine when I left for the mail. The officer nodded, writing it down. He asked if I knew the man. I shook my head. I'd never seen him before. Not in the building, not on the street. Nothing was missing from my apartment except the knife he'd taken from my own kitchen drawer. The officers took my statement, went through the rest of the unit, and told me to call if I remembered anything else. That night, Jake refused to leave. He dragged his sleeping bag into the living room and stayed on the couch. I didn't argue. In the morning, the building manager called a locksmith to replace the lock and check the windows. Police tape stretched across my bedroom door, but I kept thinking about how easy it had been for someone to break in, how quickly things had turned from normal to dangerous. I barely slept, checking the locks again and again, pacing from the front door to the bathroom and back. Over the next few days, the police told me the man had been watching the building, coming and going from the alley behind the dumpsters. They found evidence in his bag, notes about the apartment numbers, sketches of the hallways, even a spare set of keys he'd stolen from another tenant's car. He had no connection to me. He had picked my apartment because the lock was easy and I lived alone. He was taken to a psychiatric hospital for evaluation. There was no trial, just reports, interviews, paperwork. It was over fast. Jake moved in with me for the rest of the semester. I changed every lock, installed a camera over the door, and kept a flashlight and my phone on the nightstand. Each night before I went to bed, I looked under the frame, checked the closets, made sure every window was latched and double-checked. Sometimes I still wake up, convinced there's someone just out of sight, breathing in the quiet. I was lucky. I know that now. If my phone hadn't slid out of reach, if I hadn't looked under the bed, if the lock had held, maybe things would have ended differently. The idea that someone could be so close, so quiet, and you wouldn't even know. That's what sticks with me most. Even now, I never forget to look. Last summer, my wife Sarah and I decided to rent a house on the California coast through one of those vacation rental apps. We were both tired of the city and wanted our 3 kids to see something besides concrete and traffic for a week. The place we found looked perfect in the pictures. Big yard, 2 stories, decks looking out over rolling dry hills, no neighbors anywhere nearby. The host's name was Rick, and his profile had a ton of good reviews. People said he was helpful, and the place was always clean, so we felt pretty confident booking. He replied to our messages almost instantly and was flexible with our check-in time, which helped since we hit traffic on the drive up from LA. We got there around 4 in the afternoon. There's a narrow road winding up to the house and fields of yellow grass on both sides. It felt like you were driving to the middle of nowhere. The only other car we saw belonged to Rick, who was already waiting at the gate. He was in his 40s maybe, tan and thin, with sunglasses and a faded ball cap. He waved, came over, and handed me the keys. He walked us through the front door and showed us where everything was: the thermostat, the kitchen, the Wi-Fi password written on a notepad on the counter. The house was bigger than we expected, old but in good shape, and smelled a little musty, like it had been closed up for a few weeks. Rick pointed out some brochures for hikes and a binder with restaurant menus, and told us if we needed anything, He lived just a few minutes away down the road. He seemed normal, didn't linger, and after reminding us about the garbage pickup day, he left. As soon as he was gone, the kids ran upstairs arguing over which bedroom was best. Sarah and I started unloading groceries from the back of our minivan. The kitchen had big windows looking out over the empty hills, and there was a picnic table on the back deck. By the time everything was put away, the kids had already spread out their clothes and books everywhere upstairs. We figured it would be a quiet week. That first night, everything was still pretty normal. We made pasta for dinner and played a board game on the living room rug. The only strange thing was our youngest daughter, Lily, who came downstairs when we were cleaning up. She was 6. She said, "I keep hearing tapping from up above." I asked what kind of tapping, and she shrugged, looking at the ceiling. Sarah told her it was probably just the house creaking, or maybe a bird got in the attic, since we were out in the country. Lily nodded and went back up, but later when I checked, I couldn't hear anything. The wind had picked up and the old windows rattled a little, so it didn't seem strange. I made sure her window was latched and tucked her back in. The next morning, nothing felt off. The kids ate cereal on the deck, and we went for a hike down the dusty trail behind the house. There was a weird silence to the hills out there, only broken by birds and the distant sound of a car every hour or so. Sarah mentioned she didn't have any bars on her phone, but the Wi-Fi was working, so we figured it didn't matter. We grilled burgers that night and watched a movie in the living room. The older 2 kids, Max and Emma, complained that the floor upstairs was slanted, but other than that, they seemed fine. Sarah and I locked up before bed. The doors were heavy and made a solid thunk, and I made a point to check the back door twice. The second night is when things changed. Around midnight, all 3 kids burst into our bedroom at once. They were wide-eyed and talking over each other, saying, "There was a shadow in our door." Lily said she saw someone standing there, just a shape in the hall. Max insisted he heard the floorboards creak right outside. I got up, grabbed my flashlight from my bag, and did a full walkthrough of the house. First, I checked all the rooms upstairs. The hall was empty, the closets were empty, nothing under any beds. I even looked in the laundry room and behind the curtains. The only place left was the attic. There was a door at the end of the upstairs hall, painted white with a metal handle and a deadbolt. It was locked. I tried it just to make sure. We hadn't been given a key for it, and I figured it was just storage anyway. Downstairs, I checked the basement, which was unfinished and full of old paint cans and boxes. I checked the garage too, but everything looked undisturbed. No footprints, no open doors. That's when I noticed the front door was unlocked. I was sure I'd locked it before bed because the lock stuck a little and I'd had to jiggle the key to get it to turn. Now it was just hanging there, barely shut. I looked outside with my flashlight, but there was nothing except the sound of the wind in the dry grass and the distant hum of insects. I locked the door again, checked the windows in the living room, and went back upstairs. Sarah was trying to calm the kids down. She said, "They're just excited. It's a new house." I agreed, but I kept thinking about that door and the shadow they'd mentioned. The house was quiet again. I got in bed but didn't fall asleep right away, listening for any sounds from the attic above. The third morning, I got up early and went straight to the kitchen to make coffee. When I opened the fridge to grab milk, I noticed the pizza box from last night was gone. I checked the counters, the trash can, and the pantry. Nothing. Sarah was sitting at the kitchen table, scrolling through her phone, and I asked if she ate it. She shook her head, looking confused. The kids came down one by one, and all 3 insisted they hadn't touched the pizza either. I asked them twice, just to be sure, but they stuck to their story. I opened every cabinet, looked under the sink, even checked the microwave, thinking maybe someone reheated it and forgot. Nothing. That's when I started looking at the doors and windows again. Each one was still locked. The sliders to the deck were secure, all the screens in place, nothing broken. I checked the garage and even looked for footprints in the dust, but there was nothing out of the ordinary. I didn't say anything, but I felt uneasy. We spent most of the day in town, trying to enjoy ourselves, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. I kept thinking about the locked attic and the shadow in the hallway. That evening, after the kids went upstairs, I decided to call Rick. I wanted to ask him if he'd ever heard noises in the attic, or if there were animals up there, or maybe a second key he'd forgotten to leave us. I stepped into the hallway with my phone. As I started to dial Rick's number, the house was quiet except for the kids talking upstairs. The call rang twice. At that exact moment, a cell phone started ringing, muffled, from somewhere above our heads in the ceiling. I stood there frozen. The ringing went on for a few seconds, then stopped. Rick answered. "Hey, what's up?" he said, voice totally normal. Sarah came out of the bedroom holding her phone, her face pale. "Did you hear that?" she whispered. I nodded. I kept my voice down and told Rick, "We've had a few weird things happen. Food missing, noises in the attic, the kids seeing someone." Rick just said, "Do you need me to come over?" But something about his tone made me pause. Sarah pulled the kids into the master bedroom and locked the door. I ended the call and dialed 911, explaining quietly that we thought someone might be in our attic, that our host lived nearby, and we felt unsafe. The dispatcher said officers would be there as fast as possible. We sat together on the bed, the kids huddled close, waiting, listening to the sounds above us. The police arrived in about 15 minutes, lights flashing outside. We heard them calling out as they entered the house, their voices echoing down the hallways. There was the sound of footsteps, doors opening and closing, a heavy bang from the garage, and muffled shouting. We didn't move from the bedroom. After almost half an hour, there was a knock on our door. "It's the police. You're safe to come out," one of them called. I opened the door. 2 officers stood in the hall, one holding a flashlight. They told us they'd found someone in the attic space and had taken him into custody. We followed them downstairs, and through the open attic door at the end of the hallway, I could see boxes, blankets, and a camping lantern lying on the floor. They explained that the person hiding was Rick, our host. Sarah put her hand over her mouth and just stared at the officers. They told us Rick had set up a bed in the attic with canned food, bottles of water, and electronic gear. He had a laptop, headphones, and a pile of cables. He accessed the attic through a concealed door in the garage, hidden behind old paint cans. He'd been living up there the whole time. The officers also found small cameras mounted in the air vents, corners of the bedrooms, even behind the bathroom mirror. Rick had hidden devices all over the house. Everything was recording and streaming to his computer and a phone he kept up in the attic. We stood in the living room with our bags, stunned, while officers moved through the house taking pictures and bagging evidence. After a few hours, they let us leave. An officer handed me a card and told us they'd be in touch. The rental company refunded our full payment that night and arranged a hotel for us in town. The next morning, we met a detective who explained what they'd found. Rick had been running this setup for more than 2 years, targeting families and couples who rented his place. He recorded everything: conversations, showers, bedtime routines, and kept the files on hard drives. Some he streamed live. The police said they'd found hundreds of hours of footage, and there were even folders labeled with dates and the names of past guests. Rick was charged with multiple crimes: voyeurism, invasion of privacy, and illegal surveillance. He was denied bail and later sentenced to prison. The court banned him from owning or renting property again. The rental app apologized and said they'd be changing their policies for background checks. Our family had to attend counseling. The kids struggled to sleep alone for months. Sarah started double-checking every smoke detector and air vent in every hotel and rental we stayed in after that. We don't trust vacation rentals anymore. I read every review, checked the owner's history, and scanned every room for hidden cameras before unpacking. Even now, sometimes, I catch myself listening for footsteps in the attic at night. The idea that someone watched us, our kids, during what should have been a safe, private vacation, is something I can't shake. For our family, that week on the coast ruined the idea of feeling safe in a stranger's home forever. It happened when I was 19 and studying abroad in San Jose as an exchange student from Sweden. I was staying with a Swedish-American family friend named Robert and his wife while attending university. They had traveled to Sacramento for the weekend to visit relatives, leaving me alone in their house. I planned to use the quiet time to study for upcoming exams. My room was on the first floor with a large window facing their backyard. The window was wide, about 1.5 meters across, with a sliding pane and a thin, horizontal lock in the middle. It looked out on a small patio, some concrete slabs with weeds coming up between the cracks, then a fence and a narrow strip of overgrown grass. The room itself wasn't big, barely enough space for a single bed, an old wooden desk, and a bookshelf loaded with textbooks, folders, and a couple of framed photos from home. I'd only been in California a few months, but I already liked the routine at Robert's house. They usually ate dinner by 6, watched the local news in the living room, and were in bed by 10. Their house always smelled faintly of coffee and laundry detergent. That night it felt extra quiet after they left. I ate some microwaved leftovers, then brought a mug of tea to my room and set it next to my open laptop. I spread my textbooks across the desk and started reviewing for my calculus exam. I remember I could hear the soft hum of the fridge from the kitchen and the ticking wall clock in the hallway. As the evening went on, the street outside got quieter. By 10, the only noise was the occasional car passing and a distant barking dog. Every so often, headlights swept across the living room blinds and made shadows move on the hallway wall. I was used to it, but that night the shadows seemed to linger a little longer, just enough to make me glance up from my notes a few times. Once, I thought I saw something outside, maybe a movement near the fence, but I shrugged it off as a cat or a raccoon. Robert's neighbor had warned me about stray cats getting into their garbage, so I tried not to worry. Around 11, I went to the bathroom, brushed my teeth, and filled a water bottle. The house felt colder, like the heating had switched off. I checked the back door to make sure it was locked and set the deadbolt, which stuck a little as always. On the way back to my room, I noticed that the side door to the garage was cracked open, maybe an inch or two. I figured Robert might have left it open for airflow, so I shut it and turned the bolt, not really thinking much about it. I didn't see anything strange in the garage, just the usual smell of oil and cardboard boxes stacked along the wall. I turned off the hall light and settled at my desk again. The window by my desk reflected the blue screen glow. It was hard to focus, but I forced myself to finish one more chapter. The backyard looked empty, a pale patch of grass barely visible under the security light. I took a last glance at the clock, then leaned forward, scribbling formulas. I must have lost track of time, because the next thing I knew, I was waking up with my cheek pressed against my notebook, my arm tingling from where it was pinned under my head. The digital clock on my phone said it was past midnight. For a few seconds, I didn't know where I was, my brain slow and foggy. The room was dark except for my desk lamp, which was still on, casting a harsh circle of light across the papers and onto the wall. My mouth felt dry and the back of my neck was stiff. I reached up to rub my eyes and tried to sit up. Before I could move, someone's hand clamped over my mouth from behind, yanking my head back so hard my chair scraped against the desk. My body went rigid. I couldn't breathe. I felt the cold edge of something sharp press against the side of my neck. A voice, low and harsh, whispered right next to my ear. I couldn't make out the words at first, just the hot breath and the grip tightening around my jaw. Then I heard, "Don't make a sound or I'll kill you." He pressed the blade harder, enough that I didn't even try to scream. In the reflection of my desk mirror, I could see him. A figure dressed in black, his face covered by a ski mask, only his eyes showing. He stood close behind my chair, one gloved hand locked over my mouth, the other holding the knife to my throat. I saw the outline of his body, stocky, with broad shoulders, the dark clothes blending into the shadows behind me. My hands shook uncontrollably on the edge of the desk. I tried to keep still, my breaths coming in short, desperate bursts through my nose. He forced me to stand up, jerking me upright with the hands still over my mouth, the blade never leaving my skin. My legs almost buckled. The chair tipped back, knocking against the shelf. He hissed, "Don't try anything. You move, you die." I stared into the mirror, avoiding his eyes, and waited for a chance, but there was nothing I could do. He nudged me sideways, away from the desk, making me step carefully toward the window. My bare feet slipped on the edge of the rug. He stayed right behind me, the knife's tip shifting with every step. The room was suddenly full of noises I never noticed before. The refrigerator cycling, a distant siren, the soft crunch of our footsteps on the carpet. He kept glancing at the window, then back at the door, then down at my hands, as if to make sure I wouldn't grab anything. He whispered again, "Open the window." Quiet. My hands fumbled with the lock, almost dropping the latch. He shoved the knife against my neck even harder. I managed to slide the window open, the night air rushing in. I could smell damp grass, hear the distant sound of sprinklers on the next street over. He told me, in a steady voice, that he had a gun too, and if I screamed or ran, he'd shoot me before anyone could help. He made me put one leg over the windowsill, then paused, listening. My heart was pounding so hard I thought it would give me away. The only light in the room was from my desk lamp, shining straight out the window and lighting up a patch of dirt by the patio. I realized then, with a sick feeling, that he planned to take me outside, away from the street, where no one would hear or see anything. As we approached the window, his grip on my mouth loosened just enough so he could reach for the latch. His hand moved away from my face for a split second. I saw the lamp on my desk, heavy brass, the kind Robert always complained about if I left it on too long because it got hot and smelled like burnt metal. I grabbed it with both hands, lifted it over my shoulder, and swung backward as hard as I could. The base of the lamp smashed into the side of his head. I heard a sharp grunt. The man staggered sideways, crashing into the bookshelf. My calculus book and some photos fell to the floor. He dropped the knife and clutched his head with both hands. I didn't think, just dove for the open window, shoving my way through before he could recover. The bottom edge of the glass caught my forearm and split the skin open. I landed awkwardly in the flower bed outside, knees scraping the edge of a brick, dirt flying into my mouth. I rolled and scrambled up, ignoring the burning pain in my arms and feet. Behind me, I heard a heavy thud as he hit the floor, but I didn't look back. I ran, barefoot, straight across the grass toward the neighbor's house, tripping once on a sprinkler head hidden in the weeds. I screamed as loud as I could, calling for help in English, then Swedish by accident, then back to English again. Porch lights snapped on up and down the block. The neighbor's back door opened and I saw the old couple, Mr. and Mrs. Henderson, standing there in their nightclothes, mouths open. I bolted into their kitchen, bleeding from my arms and legs, shaking so badly I could barely speak. Mrs. Henderson pulled me to a chair and wrapped a dish towel around my arm. Mr. Henderson dialed 911 with trembling hands, trying to explain to the dispatcher that a student from Robert's house had been attacked and was hiding in their kitchen. I just sat there, staring at the floor, hearing every sound outside as if it was magnified. The police arrived within minutes. First a single patrol car, then more. Blue and red lights flashed across the backyard. I watched through the window as officers moved quickly, guns drawn, splitting up to surround Robert's house. They yelled out commands, their voices echoing across the fences. Mrs. Henderson stayed with me while I tried to answer questions from the first officer who came inside. I told him about the knife, the mask, the way he tried to force me out the window. I tried to remember every detail about his clothes, his voice, anything that would help. But my mind kept going blank. The police searched every room in Robert's house, turning over furniture and opening every closet and cupboard. They checked the yard, the garage, even the side alley between the houses. But they found nothing. No man in black, no gun, just drops of blood smeared on the inside windowsill and on the carpet near my desk. The broken lamp lay in two pieces on the floor, bent at the base. My phone was still open on the desk, screen smeared with blood from my hand. The police marked everything with evidence tags and took pictures of the glass shards outside. They collected blood samples and dusted for fingerprints in my room, on the window, and the hallway. They said the blood might help, that they'd run it for DNA. Nothing had been taken from the house. Robert's laptop, the television, even my phone and wallet were untouched. The detectives asked if I'd ever seen anyone watching the house, or if I'd noticed anything strange before tonight. I told them about the garage door being open, but it didn't seem important until now. They said the man's intentions were probably not robbery. I heard one officer tell another in a low voice that it was targeted, and that made me feel worse. It meant he came there for me, not just any house on the block. Robert and his wife drove back from Sacramento the same night. They got to the Hendersons just after dawn, pale and silent, arms wrapped around each other. When they heard what happened, Robert shook his head and said, "I never thought this could happen in our neighborhood." His wife started crying when she saw the cuts on my arms and insisted I go to urgent care. But the police wouldn't let anyone leave until they finished taking statements. It felt like hours before they finally let us go. The next day, Robert had the locks changed on every door and window. He called an alarm company to install a security system with motion sensors on every entry point. For days after, police cruisers drove past the house every few hours. I tried to sleep, but jumped awake at every sound. The smallest creak in the walls made my heart race. Even with Robert and his wife home, I felt like the man could come back at any time. I stopped using the desk by the window and kept the curtains drawn tight. The following week, the university arranged for me to move in with another host family across town. I packed my things in silence, avoiding the backyard, trying not to look at the broken glass embedded in the flower bed. Robert apologized again and again, but it didn't change anything. I knew they were just as shaken as I was. My new host family lived in a second-floor apartment with no direct access to the outside. I started checking every window and door lock before I went to bed, sometimes twice. It became a routine I never broke. The blood evidence from the window in my bedroom didn't lead to any arrest. Months later, the detectives told me the DNA matched samples from other attempted assaults in the city, but no suspect had ever been identified. All they had was a vague description: medium height, broad build, dark clothes. It could have been anyone. Some nights I lay awake thinking about how close he'd been to getting me out that window, how easily it could have ended differently. My parents wanted me to come back to Sweden right away, but I told them I wouldn't let one man ruin my life. I stayed in San Jose until the end of the year. I finished my exchange program, passed my exams, and went home with a diploma and a couple of scars on my arm. For a long time after, I checked every window before going to sleep and avoided first-floor bedrooms. Sometimes I wonder if hitting him with the lamp was the only reason I survived, or if he might have let me go anyway. I'll never know. I do know that sometimes, when you have nothing left to lose, fighting back isn't always the wrong choice. When I was in art school, our class set up this weekend trip to Vegas for this big contemporary art exhibition. Everything about the trip was last minute and messy, honestly. We tried to get a block of rooms somewhere nice, but there was some giant convention in town, so the only rooms left were insanely overpriced. Most of my friends managed to find a half-decent place closer to the strip by splitting with more people, but I got stuck booking this cheap motel out on the edge of town. I thought it would be fine since it was only 2 nights and I'd barely be there, just sleeping and showering. But the vibe was off the second I pulled into the parking lot. The sign was half lit, a bunch of letters burned out. There were old palm trees that looked dead, and cigarette butts everywhere. The lot itself was mostly empty, with only a few cars parked at odd angles, like nobody really cared about the lines. The pavement was cracked with weeds coming through. A couple of the lights were flickering and the others didn't work at all, so the whole side near the building was in shadow. The only noise was traffic in the distance and some buzzing from a broken soda machine next to the lobby. Inside, the lobby was tiny, just a dirty tile floor and a scratched plastic counter. The guy at the front desk didn't even look up when I came in. He was scrolling his phone, barely said anything except ID and card. His name tag was flipped over, and he had this long, chipped thumbnail. The check-in took forever, because the printer kept jamming, and he was cursing under his breath about it. There was a faded map taped to the wall with numbers for each room, and a warning about no refunds. When he handed me the key card, he didn't tell me which way to go, just nodded toward the back. I walked down this long hallway with stained carpet that had a sour chemical smell mixed with something like wet dog. There were patches where the carpet was worn down to the threads. A bunch of the doors were dented or had peeling paint. I noticed little details that bothered me. A room number taped on with masking tape, a corner with black mildew, an ice machine that looked like it hadn't worked in years. My room was on the 2nd floor. I took the stairs because the elevator had a sign on it, "Out of order." The stairwell was worse, with bare concrete steps and a flickering fluorescent light that made a buzzing noise every time I moved. There was graffiti on the railing, mostly dumb stuff, but one sharp "Get out" scratched into the metal. I tried to ignore it, but it was right where you'd put your hand. The room itself was what you'd expect for the price, but still kind of sad. There was a bed with a thin, scratchy blanket, an old TV with static, and a little table with a cracked plastic chair. The bathroom door stuck when I tried to open it. The sink had toothpaste splatters. I pulled back the bedspread and saw a hair on the sheet, but I was too tired to care by that point. I put my bag under the desk, double-checked the door lock, and looked out the window. The parking lot looked even worse from up here. I could see a dumpster overflowing in the back and one streetlight swaying a little, even though there was no wind. My friends kept texting in the group chat about their hotel, how it was right by a bunch of restaurants and they were going to pregame before the show. I just typed back that I'd meet them at the gallery and laid down for a bit, listening to the noise from the pipes in the walls. Someone stomped by in the hallway at one point and stopped outside my door. I heard a weird cough, then footsteps moving away. There were voices down the hall, but I couldn't tell what they were saying. Later, I met up with everyone for the art show. We spent hours walking around. Tons of big installations, lots of neon and weird video projections. My legs were killing me by the time it was over. They wanted to go to some after-party downtown, but I was wiped out. I left them near the entrance, promised I'd meet up the next day, and headed for the motel. By the time I drove back, it was past midnight. The streets on that side of town were mostly empty. When I turned into the parking lot, it was even darker than before. Only one of the big overhead lights worked. The rest were out or blinking, and there was a weird patch of darkness near the back of the lot, like the bulbs had all burned out at once. It felt like the shadows were thicker, almost hiding the cars. I parked as close to the front as I could and kept my backpack on one shoulder, keys in my hand. Walking through the lobby, I noticed the desk was empty now. No sign of the clerk, just the blue glow from his phone left sitting on the counter. The little bell was there, but I didn't touch it. It was quiet enough to hear the ice machine humming in the distance. I headed for the stairs, still out of order, and went up to the second floor. The stairwell was colder than before. When I got to the landing, the hallway stretched out in front of me, lit by just a few dim bulbs. I could see all the way down to where the vending machine area was, a little alcove set back from the main hallway, half hidden in shadow. Just as I reached the top of the stairs, I heard a metallic clunk, like someone bumping into the soda machine. I looked over and saw a guy standing there with his back to me, messing with the buttons. He looked like he was in his 40s or 50s, wearing a green jacket and loose jeans. He had greasy hair and a gray beard, and he moved slow, almost shuffling. I tried to walk casual, heading down the hall toward my room, but I saw him turn and look my way. He didn't say anything, just watched me, then started walking in the same direction. His steps were heavy and slow, making the old carpet creak under his boots. I glanced back once and saw him about 20 feet behind me, his head low, eyes sort of hidden under his brow. He kept a steady pace, not fast, just following in the same direction as I moved down the long, empty hallway. At first, I just thought maybe he was heading to his own room or the ice machine, so I tried to play it cool, not wanting to seem paranoid. But the more I walked, the more I noticed that every move I made, he copied. When I slowed down to dig through my purse for my keycard, he slowed too, taking smaller steps. I stopped to check my phone, pretending to read a text, and he immediately stopped, shifting his weight and patting his pockets like he was looking for his own key. I glanced at the doors along the hall, expecting him to walk up to one, but he never did. He just stayed back about 20 feet, staring at the carpet, never passing me, just always matching my pace. The lights flickered above us, throwing shadows that made the whole place feel warped and endless, like the hallway just kept going. The floor creaked under both our feet, and the silence was worse than anything. No TVs, no voices, just the hum of the vending machine far behind us. I sped up, the key now clutched tight in my hand, and he sped up too, boots making a heavier thud. I heard him cough once, a rough sound that echoed down the corridor. I made myself look back just one more time, and he was still there, head down, eyes hidden, never looking at a door, just following the exact same line I was taking. The end of the hall felt a million miles away. My room was the very last one. My heart was thumping, my breath getting tight in my chest. I told myself not to break into a run, just get there and act normal. But I could feel sweat on my palms and my fingers slipping on the plastic keycard as I tried to slide it out. When I finally reached my door, I tried to act casual, even though I could see him in my peripheral vision, just standing there now, maybe 15 feet away. He pulled out his phone and started pretending to read something on it, but his head was tilted slightly up, and I could feel his eyes locked on me. My hands were shaking as I tried to get the keycard into the reader. It beeped red, then green, finally. I pushed the door open fast, slipped inside, and slammed it behind me. I turned the deadbolt, threw the chain across, and pressed my back against the door, listening. My heart was pounding so hard I felt dizzy. I moved to the peephole and looked out. He was still standing in the hall, just outside my door. He was pretending to scroll through his phone, but he kept glancing up at my door, then looking down the hallway. After a minute, he started pacing, walking past my door, then back again, sometimes stopping and just standing, facing my door like he was thinking. The hall was dead quiet except for the hum of lights and the soft drag of his shoes on the old carpet. He did this for almost 10 minutes, walking, pausing, checking his phone, sometimes running his hand along the wall like he was feeling for room numbers. Every time he passed, he looked at my door, never knocking, never saying anything, just watching. I grabbed my own phone, fingers shaking, and texted my friends, then called them. I tried to sound calm, but my voice was tight. I told them some guy was following me, that he was right outside my door, that I didn't feel safe. They were still at the after party, but the second I explained, they said they'd come right away. I stayed by the peephole, watching the hallway, barely breathing, waiting for the guy to leave. He finally wandered off toward the stairs, walking slow, still glancing back at my door. When I was sure he was gone, I started packing my stuff up, tossing everything in my bag fast, trying not to make noise. My friends arrived 20 minutes later, texting me when they were outside. I cracked the door open, looked both ways. He was gone. The hallway was empty, just the buzzing light and the faded carpet. My friends came up to the room, checked everywhere, even opened the closet and looked under the bed, then helped me grab my suitcase and backpack. We walked together down the hall and out to the parking lot. It was almost 2 a.m., and the lot was deserted except for a couple cars and the old flickering lights. No sign of the guy. They walked with me to my car, waited while I locked it, and drove behind me all the way back to their hotel near the Strip. I crashed on the floor of their room, barely sleeping, replaying everything in my head. The next morning, after barely 2 hours of sleep, I went back to the motel to get the rest of my stuff and check out. The front desk had a different clerk, a tired-looking woman with chipped nail polish. I told her about the guy who followed me, described his age, what he was wearing, what happened in the hallway. She just shrugged, said there weren't any security cameras in the halls, and that a lot of people came and went at night. She didn't even ask for my room number or offer to call anyone. When I pressed, she said if I felt unsafe, I could call the police, but there wasn't much they could do without video. I checked out and left as fast as I could, still feeling shaky. The whole way to my friend's hotel, I kept glancing in the rearview mirror, half expecting to see that guy's green jacket behind me. For the rest of the trip, I didn't go anywhere alone. I stuck with my friends, even just walking from the gallery to the coffee shop. On the drive home, I kept thinking about how vulnerable I'd been in that motel, how easy it would have been for something to happen if I hadn't noticed him, or if my friends hadn't picked up the phone right away. Even now, I still double-check the locks when I stay somewhere new, and I always ask if there are cameras in the hall. I never saw that man again, but sometimes I still think about how close I might have come to something way worse, all because of a cheap motel room on the edge of Vegas. When I was 28, I was renting a room in this house in Portland with 2 other guys. The place was old, one of those split-level houses from the 70s with stained brown carpet and a sagging porch out front. The kitchen always smelled a little bit like someone had burned popcorn months ago and never fully aired it out. We each had our own rooms, shared a bathroom, and took turns buying paper towels and toilet paper, that kind of thing. It wasn't fancy, but it worked, and the rent was cheap enough that I could afford it while working from home as a programmer. Most days, I just sat at my desk with my laptop and a big cup of black coffee, listening to the hum of my desktop PC while I did my work. One of my roommates, Jeff, got a job offer out of state, and he had to move out almost overnight. That left the 3-bedroom place with just me and the other guy, Drew, who worked at a bike shop and was barely ever home. We decided to post an ad on Craigslist to find a new roommate, since we couldn't afford the rent without another person. We got a lot of weird replies, a few obvious scams, a guy who didn't show up for the interview, and one person who wanted to keep a pet snake the size of a garden hose. Then there was Marcus. He was a little older than us, mid-40s, salt and pepper hair, wore simple clothes, soft-spoken. He told us he worked in some office downtown and mostly just kept to himself, said he liked things quiet and spent a lot of time on his computer. He didn't seem too talkative, but he looked us in the eye, answered every question, and brought proof of income and references when we asked. After we talked to him in the living room, he seemed responsible enough. He didn't flinch at the sight of the peeling paint in the hallway or the ancient fridge. He even laughed a little when Drew pointed out the old water stain on the ceiling that looked like a wolf's head. We figured he was probably fine, maybe a little dull, but not a risk. The next weekend, he showed up with a couple of suitcases and a big box of computer gear, handed over the first month's rent, and took the empty room at the end of the hall. For the first couple weeks, he was exactly what you hope for in a roommate. Quiet, paid his rent on time, cleaned up after himself in the kitchen, and never made any noise at night. I hardly saw him except in passing, usually in the kitchen when he was heating up frozen meals in the microwave. We never really talked beyond, "Hey, what's up?" or "How's it going?" Sometimes I'd hear the low drone of his voice through his closed door, like he was on a call or maybe talking to himself, but nothing weird. He'd nod to me in the hallway, then disappear into his room with a mug of tea. I worked from home all day, and he was gone most of the day for work, so there wasn't much overlap. I'd hear his door close at night around 10 or so, and that was about it. I didn't think much about him at all, to be honest. He wasn't messy, didn't throw parties, didn't bring anyone over. Once, I noticed he labeled his food in the fridge with his name and date, but I just figured he was organized. His shoes were always lined up neatly by the door. I didn't see any friends or family visit, but some people are just private. Everything seemed normal. Drew and I talked about how lucky we got, since a bad roommate could really ruin the whole vibe of the house. We figured we'd keep things as they were for as long as possible, just pay rent, do our own thing, and not get into each other's business. Then, maybe 3 weeks after Marcus moved in, Drew announced he'd be leaving for a business trip for his job. He was some kind of sales rep and would be out of town for almost a month. That meant it would just be Marcus and me in the house. It didn't seem like a big deal. I told Drew I'd keep an eye on his mail and water his plants. He left early on a Monday, dragging his suitcase down the steps while it was still dark. When the door shut behind him, the house suddenly felt too big, the air inside quiet in a way it hadn't been before. I sat at my computer, clicking through emails, the house creaking a bit as it warmed up in the morning sun. It only took a day or two for Marcus to start acting differently. The first morning, before I even got out of bed, I heard a soft knocking at my door. It was early, maybe 7. I opened it and saw Marcus standing in the hallway in a plain gray t-shirt, holding a mug of coffee, looking a bit off. He said, "Hey, sorry to bother you, but I saw you out back this morning. Were you talking to someone?" I shook my head, told him I hadn't been outside at all, which was true. I never went into the backyard except to take out the trash. He looked at me like he didn't quite believe me, but didn't push it, just mumbled, "Okay, never mind," and went back to his room. That afternoon, I found him in the kitchen peering through the blinds, standing off to the side like he was trying not to be seen. He turned when I came in and asked, "You sure you weren't out back this morning? I saw someone who looked like you, talking to a guy by the fence." I told him again, no. I'd been working all morning, didn't even get dressed until after 10. He didn't say anything, just stared at me for a second and went back to making his tea. The next morning, there was another knock at my door, a little louder this time. I opened it, and he was there again. Same question, same tone. "Were you talking to anyone outside last night?" He said he'd seen someone through his window, said it looked like me. I told him, again, I hadn't gone outside. He seemed more agitated, like he was sure I was lying, eyes darting down the hallway, then back at me. I tried to brush it off. Maybe he was just stressed out. Maybe he had trouble sleeping or something. I didn't want to make a big deal out of it. But every day that week, he found some reason to ask about the backyard, always insisting he'd seen me out there. He started leaving his blinds closed all the time, and I caught him peeking out from behind them more than once, watching the fence. His voice got sharper, more frustrated each time I denied it. One morning he said, "I know I saw you. You were out there. I don't know who you're meeting with, but I want you to stop." I told him he must be confused. Maybe saw someone walking by on the alley behind the fence. He shook his head and said, "No, I know what I saw. Don't lie to me." After that, he wouldn't look at me for the rest of the day. I kept to my room, keeping the door locked when I worked. That was the last conversation we had that week. But every time I passed his room, I felt him listening, waiting for something. The accusations became a daily thing. Always the exact same words, same look on his face, like he was waiting for me to admit something. He'd stand right outside my door, sometimes in the hallway, sometimes right at my desk, and just start in with it. "Who was that in the backyard with you? Why are you lying?" If I tried to ignore him, he'd get louder, repeating himself until I finally answered. I kept telling him nobody had been over. I hadn't even been outside. But it didn't matter. He was stuck on that idea, repeating the story like he couldn't hear anything else. After a few days of this, I started locking my bedroom door, even during the day. It wasn't enough. Sometimes he'd just come in anyway, twisting the knob back and forth, calling my name until I opened it. One night, I woke up to find him standing in the doorway, the hallway light behind him, just staring at me. I yelled for him to leave, and he mumbled something about keeping secrets, then walked back down the hall. After that, I started pushing my dresser in front of the door at night, just to feel safer. I could hear him at night, walking around the living room, opening and closing the fridge, pacing in the kitchen, muttering to himself about meetings and strangers. He'd flick the hallway lights on and off, then slam doors and stomp back to his room. Sometimes he would start yelling in the middle of the night, my name echoing through the house. "Come out here! I know what you're doing! Come explain yourself!" It didn't matter what time it was, 2, 3 in the morning, he'd be out there demanding I come talk to him. I started sleeping with headphones in, the dresser still wedged tight against the door. I thought about calling the landlord, or maybe the police, but I kept hoping he'd calm down, that maybe he'd just have a bad week and then get back to normal. I told myself I could handle it, but every day he seemed more agitated, more certain I was plotting against him. I barely left my room except to use the bathroom or make a quick meal in the kitchen, always making sure he wasn't nearby before I left. Things finally reached a breaking point after another rough night of barely any sleep. I woke up early, hoping to slip out of the house and grab a coffee just to clear my head. I moved the dresser, got dressed quietly, and opened my door as slowly as I could. The hallway was dark, but as I started for the front door, Marcus stepped out from the shadows by the coat closet, like he'd been waiting for me. He blocked the hallway, arms crossed, standing right in front of the door. He looked worse than ever, eyes red, hair sticking out like he hadn't showered or slept in days. "Where do you think you're going?" he asked, voice low but shaking. "Who are you meeting this time?" I tried to stay calm, told him I just wanted coffee, that I'd be back in a little bit. He didn't move. "You think I don't know what's going on?" You think you can sneak around? Plot behind my back?" His hand shot out and grabbed my arm, gripped tight. He started rambling about people watching him, about cameras, about me, setting him up. His words started running together, his voice louder and faster, and I could smell the sweat and stale air on his clothes. I tried to pull free, but he just squeezed harder, repeating the same accusations. My heart was pounding, and I finally jerked my arm loose, pushed past him, and ran out the door. I didn't even bother to grab my keys or my phone charger. I just needed to get away from the house. I called a friend from my phone and told him everything, asked if I could stay the night. I crashed on his couch, barely sleeping, my mind replaying Marcus's voice and the wild look in his eyes. I kept my phone on silent, not wanting to hear if Marcus called or texted. I didn't know what he'd do if I came back alone, so I waited until morning, then asked my friend to come with me. We drove back to the house around noon. The front door was unlocked, the house cold and quiet. Marcus was in the living room, staring at the TV that wasn't even on. When he saw us, his face went slack and he just kind of mumbled hello, acting like nothing weird had happened. I asked him if we could talk, and my friend stood close by. Marcus just shook his head and started pacing, eyes never meeting ours. He seemed confused, like he couldn't remember why I was upset or what had happened the night before. When I told him I needed him to move out, he didn't argue. He just said okay, asked if he could have a week to pack his things. I said that was fine, as long as he didn't bother me anymore. He kept to himself that week, barely coming out of his room except to use the bathroom. The only sound was the scraping of boxes and furniture as he packed. When he finally left, the house was a mess. His bedroom door was missing its lock, holes punched in the drywall. He had pulled down the smoke detectors from the hallway and living room, left the batteries scattered on the kitchen counter. The blinds in his room were ripped down, and he'd left trash bags full of old clothes and food wrappers in the closet. We spent hours cleaning up, replacing locks, patching holes, screwing the smoke detectors back in place. Our landlord was furious when he saw the damage, made us pay for repairs out of our deposit. A couple days later, I ran into one of the neighbors while taking out the trash. She told me she'd seen Marcus wandering the neighborhood at night before he moved in, said he'd been living out of his car for months. She said he had some issues, used to talk to himself or yell at passing cars, but always seemed harmless until he got stressed. I looked up his name online later and found a few mentions about mental health, but nothing official. It made sense now, the way things fell apart so quickly. I realized then that you really don't know who you're living with. Not really. People can seem perfectly normal until they're not, and you can't always see it coming. The whole thing left me jumpy in my own home, double-checking locks, waking up at every noise for weeks after. Even now, I still wonder what would have happened if I hadn't left when I did, or if Marcus had decided not to go so quietly. Sometimes, the scariest people aren't strangers. They're the ones you share your walls with, and you never know how fast things can get out of control. Last year when I was 25, I enrolled in this month-long maritime training course in Norfolk to get certified for merchant ship work. It was a big building out by the docks, looked like it used to be a shipping office or some kind of government building before they turned it into a school. Every day you could smell the salt water through the open windows, and the whole place had that humid, metallic scent from the old radiators. Most of the other students were around my age, a mix of guys who had worked on boats before, and a few who looked like they had just finished college or were stuck in a rut. The schedule was tight, with class starting at 7:30 a.m., and after a few days, everyone was tired and kind of cranky from the drills and long hours. There was this 58-year-old guy named Ralph who stood out for all the wrong reasons. First day, he wore a windbreaker with the logo of some insurance company, khaki pants, and these heavy brown loafers that squeaked on the floors. The rest of us had hoodies, running shoes, old jeans. Right away, Ralph was different. He sat at the front, leaning forward in his chair, and as soon as the instructor started talking about life jackets and cold water survival, Ralph's hand shot up. Instead of asking anything about the equipment, he launched into a story about how his uncle once fished in the Bering Sea and nearly died in a storm. The instructor, a guy named Mr. Tolan, tried to bring him back on topic, but Ralph just kept talking, mixing in facts that made no sense. It wasn't just once. Every class, he would interrupt, asking weird questions about things like if you could use duct tape to patch a lifeboat, or if polar bears ever boarded ships in the Arctic. Sometimes he rambled about unrelated stuff like insurance or old jobs he had. The first week, most of us tried to ignore him, but soon people started rolling their eyes every time he opened his mouth. Even the instructors lost patience after a while. You could see Mr. Tolan's face tighten every time Ralph raised his hand. In group drills, Ralph could never keep up. We had to do fire hose practice outside, and he dropped the nozzle twice, soaking his own boots and falling behind everyone. His breath whistled from the effort. The physical stuff was harder for Ralph. During the lifeboat launch simulation, he got stuck climbing down the ladder and froze up halfway, blocking the rest of the line. "Just go around me," he called, but there was nowhere to go. One of the instructors had to climb up and talk him down while the rest of us waited at the bottom. People muttered, and Sarah, a girl from upstate, shot me a look. Later, in the lounge, you could hear people making jokes about the old guy on the ladder. Ralph never seemed to notice. By the end of the first week, things were tense whenever Ralph was in the room. He'd linger after class to tell long stories about ships he saw on TV or arguments with his neighbors. Nobody wanted to sit next to him, and he didn't seem to get the hint. At dinner in the student cafeteria, he'd bring his tray over to our table without asking, sitting at the edge and talking through every bite. Once he asked one of the instructors how many people died on ships every year. He seemed to think it was thousands, maybe tens of thousands. He couldn't believe it when the instructor said that's not true. After class, I overheard two students betting on how soon he'd quit. The course was only 4 weeks, but it felt longer. After 10 days, we started the written exams. Most of us passed, but Ralph failed his first 2 tests, missing basic questions about navigation lights and radio protocols. In the practicals, he mixed up fire extinguisher types and got lost during the smoke maze exercise. The instructors had to pull him out because he panicked, yelling that he couldn't breathe even though he was crawling right by the exit. When the results came back, it was official. Ralph was out. The director called him into the office and told him he'd failed too many assessments, so he couldn't stay in the program. Word spread quickly. Most people figured that was it, and Ralph would be gone by the weekend. But Ralph had paid for his dorm housing through the end of the month, so they let him stay in the student quarters. The main building had 4 floors, 2 reserved for students, and the dorms were old but clean. He was assigned to a double room on the 3rd floor, next to the laundry and across from the vending machines. Everyone just figured he'd keep to himself after being kicked out. Instead, that's when things got weird. Right away, Ralph started following Sarah around. She was quiet, good at the practicals, and kept to herself mostly. Ralph would show up at her table during meals, always offering to help her carry something, even though she didn't have much. If she was in the study room, Ralph would drift in and sit nearby, shuffling papers and glancing at her. Once, I heard him say, "I'm good with computers, if you need any help." She just said, "No thanks," and kept working. But he hung around, talking to himself under his breath. It was like he didn't get that she wanted to be left alone. Ralph's roommate, a skinny guy from Ohio, started complaining that Ralph kept him up at night. He said Ralph would stand in front of the mirror for long stretches, whispering to himself and striking weird poses. Sometimes he'd talk about the course as if he was still in it, practicing radio calls out loud or pretending to steer a ship, all while staring at his reflection. The roommate said he'd wake up to Ralph just standing there, looking at himself, not moving. The lights from the hallway would spill in under the door, and you could see his outline, stiff and silent. The guy started sleeping with earbuds in after that, just to drown out the mumbling. One afternoon, I walked by the common room and saw Ralph standing by the vending machine, just watching Sarah as she tried to read a textbook on the couch. She kept her eyes down, flipping pages, but every few minutes he would shuffle closer, pretending to look for change or check the drinks inside. I heard him say, "Do you need anything? I can get you a soda." But she shook her head. When someone else came in, he wandered off, but you could tell he wasn't done. The next day, Sarah mentioned to me quietly that she was thinking of asking to switch rooms, just in case Ralph tried to find out where she slept. It wasn't just Sarah. Ralph started popping up in places nobody expected. People would be in the laundry room late, and Ralph would just be there, folding clothes that didn't even look like his. Someone said he watched them through the glass while they waited for their load to finish. A few nights later, the roommate told me Ralph stayed up pacing between the bed and the window, muttering about how they never gave him a real chance. He kept saying, "I could have passed if they just explained it right," like he was practicing some speech to himself. The last thing I heard that week was that Ralph's roommate had gone to the dorm supervisor to ask for a room change. He said he couldn't take another night of Ralph talking to himself and posing in front of the mirror, standing completely still with his hands pressed to the glass, just staring at his own face. I tried to avoid Ralph because something about him made me uncomfortable, but the dormitory was small, and there were only 2 hallways on our floor. Everyone had to use the same narrow staircase and kitchen, so I'd see him even when I didn't want to. Sometimes I'd walk to the vending machines just to get out of my room, but he'd be there, sitting in one of the old chairs by the window, staring at nothing. I noticed he watched people as they moved around the hall, not really looking away if you met his eyes. When people talked about him, they lowered their voices, like he might be listening. It seemed like Ralph had started to fixate on random details about everyone. He would remember if you wore the same shirt twice in a week, or if you liked your coffee black, and then bring it up later like it meant something. Once, I was folding my laundry, and Ralph came in, holding a bag of his clothes. He stood there for a second, then walked over and asked if I wanted to split the dryer. I told him I was almost done, but he just smiled and said, "You know, it's funny, we have the same birthday." I paused and said, "Oh, really?" trying to sound polite. He leaned in closer, lowering his voice. "August 14th. That means something, don't you think? Not just a coincidence. Maybe people are meant to meet." I tried to laugh it off, mumbling, "Maybe," but his stare didn't change. He went on about fate, how things lined up in ways you couldn't predict. The more he talked, the more I realized he had memorized little facts about me, stuff I'd never even mentioned to him. I told him I had to get back to studying, shoved my clothes into the basket, and left. After that, I started using a different laundry room, 1 floor up, even though I wasn't supposed to. From then on, it felt like Ralph was everywhere. He'd pop up at the end of the hall when I left my room, or I'd find him sitting alone in the lounge at night, eyes open, just staring. He would sometimes follow me with his gaze when I passed, or whisper to himself in a way that sounded like he was reciting things over and over. A couple of the other students started talking about leaving the dorms early if they could get refunds. Sarah avoided the lounge altogether, going straight from class to her room and locking the door. The atmosphere in the dorm felt tighter every day, like everyone was just waiting for the next weird thing to happen. The final incident happened about a week before the end of the course. I had just finished a fire safety class and went to the locker room to change out of my uniform. The place was empty, just the sound of running water from one of the showers. I was at my locker, half-dressed, when I heard the door open. I glanced up and saw Ralph walk in, holding a duffel bag. I hoped he would just get his stuff and go, but instead he came straight toward me, not even pretending to do anything else. He stood way too close enough that I could smell his sweat and whatever cologne he used to cover it. He started talking right away, voice low, saying he'd been thinking about me a lot and that it didn't make sense to waste time since he'd be gone soon. Then he put his hand on my shoulder and said, "We should hang out, just the two of us. You know there's something here, right?" I shrugged him off and told him to back off, but he stepped closer, almost blocking me against the lockers. "Don't be shy," he said. "I know you feel it too. We have a connection. Don't lie to yourself." I pushed past him, grabbed my bag, and left without saying anything else. He followed me out of the locker room, still talking, but I walked faster and headed straight to the admin office without looking back. At the front desk, I told the staff what had happened. My hands were shaking, and I had trouble getting the words out, but they understood right away that it was serious. One of the admins brought me into a back office to write down everything, then said they would take care of it. I sat there for a while, trying to calm down, until another staff member came to check on me and told me they would handle the situation. The rest of the day, I kept expecting to see Ralph in the hall, but he never showed up. The next morning, the whole dorm was tense. Word spread that Ralph had been pulled out of his room early, escorted by 2 school officials, and taken off campus. That afternoon, the director called a meeting with everyone who stayed in the dorms. He told us that after reviewing Ralph's records, they had discovered he had lied on his application. He was supposed to report a criminal history, including domestic violence and a restraining order violation. The address he'd used was fake. He'd actually been homeless for months before enrolling in the course. The only reason he stayed so long was that he'd paid for the room in advance, and the school hadn't checked his background until the complaint. After that, I never saw Ralph again. The rest of the course went by slowly, with people sticking to their own rooms and avoiding the common areas. Sarah left early, saying she'd rather lose the housing money than stay another night. I finished my certification, but everything about the last 2 weeks made me rethink how easy it is for someone unstable to slip through the cracks. Merchant shipping is one of those jobs where you're trapped with the same people for months at a time, and you have to trust everyone to at least be safe. Since then, I've been a lot more careful about who I talk to and how much I share when I'm in a closed environment. Even now, I still double-check my locks before I go to sleep. Last summer, we took our 8-year-old daughter Sophie to South Beach in Miami for a family vacation. It was a Saturday afternoon, bright sun, loud music, a lot of people on the sand. The section we picked was near one of the public access points, so it was busy, with umbrellas everywhere, and families lined up almost shoulder to shoulder. Sophie loves building sandcastles, so we set up our folding chairs and cooler about 50 feet from the water, between the line of lifeguard towers and a pile of seaweed. She started digging right away, her little blue shovel in hand, dumping buckets of wet sand, focused on making a moat. There were other kids out there doing the same thing. The crowd felt relaxed. A few people tossed footballs in the shallows. A couple of college guys near us kept joking about the water being cold, and the families on our other side seemed to have set up for the whole day, with picnic baskets and even a speaker playing quiet pop music. My wife set up the sunshade and unpacked snacks, and I took out my book, but kept one eye on Sophie. She's always been the kind of kid who likes doing her own thing, But she listens when we give her the rules. Never go out deeper than your knees. Don't leave our sight. Don't talk to strangers. That sort of thing. She waved at us now and then, held up shells for us to see, sometimes calling out when a wave knocked down her towers. There's a comfort in the rhythm of these places. You hear the gulls and the breeze, the murmur of other families, the lifeguard's occasional whistle when someone swims out too far. I kept my eyes moving from Sophie, to the water, to the crowds. A few people had little tents set up by the edge of the dunes, and the row of rental umbrellas curved toward the pier in the distance. The sand was hot underfoot, but not unbearable, and Sophie was lost in her game, focused, singing softly to herself. My wife dozed off for a little while behind her sunglasses. I watched people walking the shore, saw some teenagers with boogie boards, a dad teaching his toddler to jump the foam as the waves came in. I remember thinking it felt normal, safe, like nothing bad could happen here in the middle of all these people and noise and sunlight. We'd been there a couple hours already. The cooler was half empty, our sandwiches gone. Sophie was still out there, her skin starting to pink up even with sunscreen, kneeling beside her half-finished castle. I stood up and stretched my back, glanced at my phone, scrolled the news for a few minutes. At one point, Sophie came back for a snack and a drink, her hair damp and sandy, cheeks flushed from the sun. She dropped her shovel beside the cooler and grabbed a water bottle. I squatted down beside her, brushing sand from her face. She looked happy, barely standing still before she was tugging at my arm. "I want to make the moat deeper," she said, already twisting the cap back on the bottle. "Can I go back?" We reminded her about the rules. Stay close, don't go near the jetty. If you need anything, come get us. She nodded quickly, impatient, and started trotting back toward her castle, taking a wide arc to avoid a group of kids playing tag. My wife sat up, watched her too. "She's fine," she said, but I kept watching, just out of habit. The sun was dropping a little lower in the sky now, and a few families had started packing up, folding towels, dragging coolers back up the sand. I watched Sophie head back toward her spot by the water. She had to pass the changing rooms and the outdoor shower area, a row of concrete stalls with faded paint and a low cinder block wall, right at the edge of the paved walkway. There's a foot rinse there, usually a few people rinsing sand off, and sometimes people sitting on the benches nearby with their phones. As she got closer to that area, I noticed a man standing near the changing rooms. He was alone, not dressed for the beach. Jeans, dark t-shirt, shoes instead of sandals. He didn't have any of the usual gear. No towel, no bag, no hat, no cooler, nothing that said he was here with anyone. He was just standing there, hands in his pockets, watching the kids playing in the sand. He didn't look at the adults. I glanced around, thinking maybe he was waiting for someone, but nobody waved at him or walked over. He just stood there, stiff, not moving much except his head, scanning back and forth. It was the way he stood that caught my attention. How he leaned against the wall but never sat down, eyes moving over the kids but never lingering on one for long. Every once in a while, he'd glance up at the boardwalk, then look back at the water. I watched as Sophie walked past him. She didn't notice him, just kept her head down, clutching her shovel, moving quickly past the changing rooms and shower. My wife said something to me, but I kept watching the man. Something about him making my neck prickle. He didn't do anything. Didn't move towards Sophie. Didn't even look at her directly. But he was definitely paying attention to that whole area. Mostly the kids, but not in the way you'd expect from a dad or a lifeguard. I shifted my chair, sat up straighter, didn't take my eyes off the guy. Sophie passed him without stopping, stepping carefully around a broken shell in the sand, then hurried back to her castle, kneeling back down to dig. The man kept standing there, glancing back and forth, just far enough away that it wasn't obvious what he was looking at. I watched him, counting the seconds, thinking I'd just keep an eye out, just in case. As Sophie walked back toward her sandcastle, I kept my eyes on the man near the changing rooms. Just as she passed by him, he leaned forward a little and called out something. I saw Sophie stop, looking uncertain, turning to face him. My wife and I both stood up at the same moment, our beach chairs scraping the sand. We've drilled it into Sophie not to talk to strangers, especially grown-ups who approach her when she's by herself. The man was gesturing toward the backside of the changing rooms, saying something with his hands out, trying to seem friendly. Even from a distance, I could tell Sophie was uncomfortable. She kept shaking her head, taking small steps backward, her hands balled at her sides. The guy moved a step closer, still talking, and suddenly reached out, almost like he wanted to grab her arm. That was the moment Sophie remembered everything we taught her. She let out a scream, loud, sharp, the kind that cuts through all the background noise of a busy beach. I saw a few heads turn, people sitting up and looking around. Sophie turned and sprinted away from the man, running in a straight line across the sand right back to us, still yelling. I met her halfway, dropping my hat and sunglasses in the process, and scooped her up, pulling her in close. My wife was beside us in seconds. Sophie was shaking, clutching at my shirt, her face blotchy with tears and sand. I looked back over my shoulder at the changing rooms, trying to spot the man. He was already backing away, disappearing around the far side of the building, moving fast, but not running. A couple of people nearby were looking at us, confused, trying to figure out what was going on. A few other adults on the beach who'd heard Sophie screaming stood up, watching the area near the showers. My wife stayed with Sophie, holding her and murmuring to her, while I told two men nearby what had just happened. Without a word, they started moving toward the changing area with me, walking fast. We cut across the sand, calling out. But by the time we reached the showers and checked behind the cinder block wall, the guy was gone. No sign of him anywhere. He had slipped out through the parking lot or down the boardwalk. I circled the building once, scanning the crowds, but it was just families, kids, a couple of beach vendors. Back at our chairs, Sophie was still crying, but she managed to tell us what happened. The man had told her he'd lost his son's toy behind the buildings and needed help finding it. When she said no, he tried to take her hand, so she screamed and ran. We called beach security right away. A guard arrived in less than a minute, listening closely as we described the man and what he did. My wife comforted Sophie, brushing sand from her face and telling her over and over how proud we were. The security guard called in our report over his radio and asked us to wait. He seemed tense but focused, scanning the crowd himself. Soon, two more guards came over, and they started talking to other families and checking the boardwalk exits. Within 20 minutes, two police officers arrived. They listened to Sophie's story again, crouching down beside her to get the details. What the man looked like, what he said, which direction he went. They took our information and led Sophie and me over to the security office by the parking lot to review camera footage. The officers asked if she would recognize him again, and Sophie nodded, holding tight to my hand. My wife stayed with our things, watching every move, not letting Sophie out of her sight after that. Police reviewed the security camera footage from the changing rooms and the surrounding area. They found several clear shots of the man walking the edge of the beach, always close to the areas where kids were playing. The officers told us quietly that he had been at the beach several times that week, always alone, always standing or sitting near the playground or the changing rooms. Other parents had noticed him too, and a few had already reported him for acting strangely, though nothing had happened until now. The police put out an alert for him, sending his photo and description to other patrols along the coast. Security at the beach increased, with more guards and police officers patrolling every day. They spoke with other families, warning them to keep close watch on their kids and to call immediately if they saw anything unusual. For the rest of our vacation, we kept Sophie close, never letting her go anywhere alone, even for a minute. We skipped the crowded spots, chose quieter areas, and took turns watching the water. Sophie was quieter for a few days, a little more anxious, but she listened when we explained again why we have those safety rules. We walked her through what happened, reminding her that she did exactly the right thing. She said no, she screamed, she ran for help, and she told us everything right away. We tried to keep things as normal as possible, playing board games in the hotel room, walking to get ice cream, sticking to routines. But every time we went to the beach after that, we both watched the crowds much more carefully, eyes darting from face to face, scanning for anyone standing alone, anyone who didn't fit in. We didn't hear back from the police before we left, but we checked the news every day, looking for updates. There were reports about increased security on local beaches, reminders for parents to watch their kids, and a warning about a man who had tried to lure a child. Sophie seemed to bounce back by the end of the week, especially when we praised her for being smart and brave. We made sure she knew it was okay to be scared, but she should always trust her gut and come to us, no matter what. The last day of our trip, we sat on the balcony overlooking the water, watching the sunset together. Sophie asked if she could go down to the pool. We said yes, but one of us stayed with her at all times, never letting her out of sight. We talked quietly that night, my wife and I, about how things had almost gone very differently, about how a normal family vacation can turn dangerous in seconds, about how you never really expect it to happen to you until it does. We went home a little changed. We talked to Sophie's teachers and made sure the school had our updated emergency contacts. We told friends and neighbors what had happened, and a few of them shared their own close calls. We realized that it only takes a moment of distraction for someone to try something awful, even in broad daylight with hundreds of people around. We became the parents who watch a little too closely, who check the doors twice, who never let their guard down completely. The memory of that day stayed with us, a reminder that there's no such thing as too careful, that teaching your kid what to do in a bad situation can make all the difference. We told Sophie how proud we were that she listened, that she was brave enough to run and get help, that she trusted her instincts even when an adult tried to convince her otherwise. For the rest of the summer, and maybe for a lot longer, we kept Sophie close, always watchful, knowing how fast things can change and how lucky we were that she came running back to us. So when I was 19, I worked evenings as a pizza delivery driver to pay for college. Most deliveries were routine, apartments, offices, regular customers who knew me by name. That Thursday started like any other shift. I clocked in just after 4, grabbed a soda from the back, and checked the order board. There was nothing unusual until around 7, when the phone rang and the boss handed me a slip. The address wasn't the normal apartment complex or suburban house. This one was in the industrial district, written down with extra directions underlined twice. I picked up the order in the warmer and glanced at the notes. Meet in parking lot behind old factory, across from storage units. Call on arrival. No street number, just a lot name. The number listed was a local cell. The ticket was already paid online with a big tip. I asked my manager if we'd delivered there before. He shrugged and said he didn't remember. The phone voice had been quiet, almost whispering. Not much to go on. I just said okay. We got weird ones sometimes, especially at the end of the month, but most turned out fine. I drove a company car, an old gray sedan with the pizza sign on top. There was no GPS, so I used my phone for directions. The industrial district was a couple miles from downtown, past a gas station and a row of auto shops that all looked closed. The farther I drove, the less traffic there was. The sun had already gone down, and streetlights were patchy, leaving some blocks in darkness. I turned off the main road onto a side street lined with empty lots and half-boarded warehouses. The lot the caller mentioned was easy to spot because it was huge, full of cracks, weeds growing through the pavement, and only 2 lights working. There was nobody around, no cars except mine, and a beat-up van way at the far end. I parked near the entrance, under one of the working streetlights. I sat for a minute with the engine running, just looking at the buildings. Some of the warehouse doors had graffiti and old for lease signs. There was a chill in the air, but I kept the window down in case someone tried to wave me over. I double-checked the slip and picked up my phone, planning to call the number. Before I even started dialing, I saw movement in the shadows behind the storage buildings. A man in a dark hoodie stepped out and started walking toward my car. He wasn't in any hurry, just walking like he'd done it before, hands in his pockets. His hood was up, and I couldn't see his face. He came closer, staying in the dim light at the edge of the lot. I rolled my window down a little and held the pizza box on my lap. "You the one who called?" I asked. He nodded, but didn't come right up to the window. He stopped a few feet away, just out of reach. Something about the way he stood made me uneasy. Feet spread wide, shoulders hunched, not making eye contact. He kept one hand in his pocket, the other loose at his side. I glanced down at the pizza box, then back up at him. The whole area was silent except for a distant train horn. He shifted from one foot to the other and then said, "You got the order?" His voice was low, almost too quiet. I pushed the box out the window, expecting him to take it, but he didn't move. Instead, he looked up and scanned the lot, as if he was checking for someone else. I looked over my shoulder but didn't see anyone. The feeling in my gut got worse. "You want to take it?" I said, trying to keep my voice calm. He stepped forward a few inches, still not making eye contact. He kept glancing at my car, then at the lot entrance. I noticed his shoes were dirty, like he'd walked a long way. There was something off about the way he hovered near the car, too. He wasn't nervous, but he wasn't relaxed either. Just tense, like he was waiting for a cue. I leaned back a little and looked at my phone. No new messages, no missed calls. I could see the glow of my dashboard clock. The seconds felt longer than normal. He finally reached out and took the pizza, quick, with just one hand. His other hand stayed buried in his hoodie pocket. I noticed his fingernails were bitten down, dirty, and the skin on his knuckles looked scraped up. He held the box low, not looking at it. "You paid online," I said, watching his other hand. He nodded again. "Thanks." His reply was barely above a whisper. He didn't move away, just stood there. The air felt thick, heavy, like I shouldn't roll up the window yet. I kept my foot on the brake and the engine running. He looked up at me, just for a second. I finally got a glimpse of his face, pale, thin, with sunken cheeks and dark circles under his eyes. No smile, no frown, just blank. He looked past me into the back seat, then at my passenger window. I realized the whole time he hadn't actually looked at the pizza or at me, just around, as if he was waiting for something else to happen. The streetlight buzzed and flickered overhead. For a second, he just stared at my car. I gripped the steering wheel, ready to drive off, but I stayed still. He seemed to notice I was on edge, because he finally took a step back from the window, still holding the pizza with one hand, the other deep in his pocket. He glanced down at the ground, then back at the storage units. Then he turned and started walking away, back into the shadows he'd come from, slow and casual. I watched him disappear behind a dumpster. I waited a few seconds, heart beating faster, then checked my mirrors and the lot again. The lot was still empty except for the van at the far end, unmoved. I rolled up the window, locked the doors, and sat there for a minute, watching for movement. The streetlight buzzed again. I didn't see him come back. I took a steady breath, put the car in gear, and drove out of the lot, glancing once more at the dark warehouse as I turned back toward the main road. The man reached my window and silently held out his hand for the pizza box. I hesitated, glancing at the slip in my hand. "What's the name on the order?" I asked, trying to keep my voice steady. He didn't answer. He just stared at me, face mostly hidden by his hood, fingers twitching as he waited. For a second I thought about just handing it over, but something about his stare made me freeze. Then, faster than I expected, he reached in and grabbed my wrist through the open window. His grip was iron. I jerked back, but he squeezed harder, thumb pressing into the bones of my hand. The pizza box slipped and landed on my lap. "Give it here," he said, so quiet I barely heard it. Before I could react, I heard footsteps running across the lot, heavy, quick, echoing on the cracked asphalt. 3 more men came out from behind a row of parked trucks at the far side of the lot. I caught a glimpse of their faces, then saw the metal pipes and crowbars in their hands. They moved with purpose, spreading out as they came. One went straight to the passenger side and yanked at the handle, rattling it. Another tried the back doors, pulling hard enough that I heard the locks groan. The last one moved to stand behind my car, blocking the way out. My heart hammered in my chest. The man holding my wrist didn't let go. He leaned closer, his breath fogging the glass. "Hand over your cash and your phone," he said, his voice flat. He still didn't shout. He didn't look angry or excited, just focused, like this was something he did every day. The others circled my car, checking the windows and doors, glancing up and down the street. One banged his pipe against the roof, making a hollow ringing sound that seemed way too loud in the empty lot. I tried to think. My wallet was in my jacket pocket, phone on the seat beside me. I looked down, then back up at the man in the hoodie. His eyes never left mine. I tried to twist my arm free, but he only squeezed tighter, nails digging into my skin. One of the others called out, "Hurry up, man!" The one by the back door kicked the tire, sending a jolt through the car. Adrenaline kicked in. I took a deep breath and wrenched my arm back, feeling skin scrape and burn as I pulled away from the window frame. The man cursed but let go, stumbling a step backward. I didn't wait. I dropped the pizza box on the floor and slammed the car into drive. My foot hit the gas and the car jumped forward. I heard a heavy thud as the bumper hit something. A body, maybe a leg. Someone shouted. In the mirror, I saw one of the men rolling on the ground, arms flailing. The others ran after the car, pipes swinging, but they couldn't keep up. I sped out of the lot, tires screeching, and took the first left I could. My hands shook on the wheel. I checked the rear view. No one was following. I kept driving, making random turns, heading back toward the lights of downtown. I didn't stop until I reached the police station, parking right in front of the entrance, barely able to put the car in park. Inside, I went straight to the front desk. My voice shook as I told the officer what happened. They led me to a small office and gave me a paper cup of water. 2 detectives asked for every detail, making me repeat the story 3 times. I described the men, what they wore, how they moved, the way they surrounded my car without saying a word to each other. I remembered the shape of their crowbars, the metal pipes, the stains on their jackets, the way the first man's grip left marks on my wrist. The officers said they'd been tracking a string of robberies just like this one. Delivery drivers lured to empty lots with prepaid orders, fake numbers, and impossible directions. 5 other drivers had been hit in the last month. 2 were in the hospital. Broken bones, a concussion. 1 had lost teeth when a pipe caught him in the face. Most lost their cash, their phones, and sometimes their cars. They took my statement and asked if I could help with sketches. An officer sat beside me as I went through mugshot books, searching for faces that matched what I remembered. They showed me surveillance footage from nearby businesses. A few days later, they called me back in. They'd arrested 3 of the men. The 4th, the one who'd grabbed my wrist, was still missing. They'd found fake phone numbers, online payment cards, and handwritten maps of delivery zones in one of the suspects' apartments. The police said the gang had been planning these robberies for weeks. They mapped out delivery routes, watched pizza shops, and tracked which drivers were out alone, always picking spots where nobody would see or hear what happened. Every move had been practiced, right down to where they'd stand and which doors they'd try first. I went back to the pizza shop the next day and told my boss what happened. He offered a few days off, but I said I was done. I packed up my things, left my uniform on the break room table, and walked out. That weekend, I found a job at the campus coffee shop. The pay wasn't as good, but the work felt safer, even when it got busy. Sometimes I still drive by that part of town, and every time I pass a deserted lot, my pulse quickens a little. I don't deliver pizzas anymore, and I don't ignore my gut when something feels wrong. The extra cash isn't worth it, not when you realize how quickly a normal night can turn into a nightmare. I never saw the man in the hoodie again, but I still checked the locks twice, and I never forget how cold his hand felt on my skin. When I graduated college last year, I moved to Chicago for an internship with a nonprofit organization. My starting pay was low, just enough to cover groceries and a monthly train pass. I remember scrolling through listing after listing, shocked at the prices for apartments in any neighborhood I recognized from the city map. My college roommate lived in Lincoln Park and always said it was nice, but her rent was 3 times what I could afford. I started with areas near my office, then kept widening the search radius until my screen filled up with places I'd never heard of and could barely pronounce. Some places looked like they hadn't been updated since the 70s. Others had warnings in the reviews about mice or noisy neighbors. I started feeling desperate. The longer I looked, the less hopeful I got. A week before my start date, I found a listing with just 2 pictures and a few lines of description. Lincoln Park Studio, utilities included, available now, $650 month. The photos were grainy and too dark, but I could tell it was a real building, not one of those sketchy houses with boarded-up windows. I clicked through the images. A bed, a radiator, some cheap-looking blinds, but the street outside looked quiet. There was no floor plan, not even a photo of the bathroom, but the location was better than anything I'd seen, and it was almost half the price of similar studios nearby. I figured it would be gone already or some kind of scam, but I called the number anyway. The man picked up on the first ring. His voice sounded a bit formal, maybe Eastern European, but he switched to friendly fast. He told me his name was David and said the unit was still available. He seemed really eager when I explained I was ready to sign a lease immediately if it checked out. "You come tonight?" he said. I could hear other voices and what sounded like a TV in the background, so I figured he was at home. He explained that the apartment had just been listed, and he was hoping to get someone in quickly, since the last tenant was moving out the next day. He asked a few questions, where I was moving from, how long I'd stay, if I had pets. I told him I didn't, and was just starting my first job out of college. He said, "Okay, you come at 7? I show you the place." I agreed. He gave me an address and told me to call him when I arrived. I spent the rest of the afternoon looking up the building online. I found it on Google Maps, a 3-story red brick place with small windows. The sidewalk out front was cracked, but the front steps looked swept clean. There weren't many reviews, but the ones I found were okay. Nothing too alarming. Some people said it was quiet, a couple of complaints about heat in the summer, but no mentions of bed bugs or break-ins. I kept telling myself it couldn't be that bad. At 6:45, I took the train north and walked the last few blocks through a part of Lincoln Park I'd never seen. There were lots of big old trees, cars parked close together, not many people out. The air felt damp, and the sidewalk still had puddles from earlier rain. I found the address, a solid-looking brick building with a worn but steady buzz from the front intercom. There was no sign for a management company, just a piece of tape where a sticker had been peeled away. A man was waiting by the door. He looked like the type of guy you'd see shopping for groceries late at night. Average build, thinning hair, navy polo shirt tucked into jeans, clean sneakers. He smiled as I approached and introduced himself as David. He didn't shake my hand, just nodded, then gestured to follow him inside. The front entry smelled faintly of cleaning chemicals and something else, like old carpet. He pressed the elevator button, but after waiting a few seconds, shrugged and led me up a narrow staircase. We walked up to the second floor, past a fire extinguisher on the wall and 2 other apartment doors, one with a sticker that said, "No soliciting." He stopped in front of a door that was already open. "Here," he said. "Tenant still lives here, but you see." I stepped in behind him, expecting an empty space, but instead, the place looked lived in. Really lived in. Shoes by the door, a jacket tossed on the couch, kid's backpack in the corner. There was a faint smell of coffee and something sweet, like baked apples. Family photos were everywhere, on the side table, tacked to the fridge, even taped near the bed. Books lined the shelf, and the bathroom door was half open with towels hanging on a hook. In the small kitchen, bags of groceries sat on the counter, bread and eggs and a pack of soda. I didn't say anything at first. David noticed me looking around, probably at my puzzled face. "It's normal," he said, gesturing at the stuff. "He moves out tomorrow. Always like this. Sometimes no time to clean before." "You see space, yes?" He walked ahead and pointed out the radiator under the window, the closet, the little desk tucked against the wall. I opened the fridge out of habit and saw milk, orange juice, a container of soup. The freezer had ice packs and a few boxes. David watched me, then pulled open the closet door to show how much space there was, talking about how rent included heat and water, no extra fees. He kept moving quickly, pointing out where the trash was taken, where to pick up mail, and mentioning that neighbors were quiet, no problems. As he talked, he kept glancing at the hallway, then at his phone. I noticed the family photos again. They looked recent, one with a man, a woman, 2 kids, all bundled up in winter coats on what looked like a snowy street. There was a kid's drawing stuck on the fridge, a blue scribble that looked like a house. David saw me looking. "Yes, family," he said. "He is good tenant, just job moves him out. I find new one right away." "You like the place?" He seemed in a hurry, checking his watch. I kept trying to focus on the layout, but the sense of being inside someone else's home made it hard to think. David leaned against the door, waiting for my answer. As we walked further into the apartment, I realized something was off. The living room was bigger than any studio I'd seen. There was a hallway, then 2 doors. I peeked in and saw a bedroom with a double bed, shelves lined with books and toys, and a window facing the alley. The other bedroom had a small desk and more photos taped to the wall. There was even a second closet, bigger than the first. For a second I thought maybe I had misread the listing, But then I remembered the price. Even a tiny studio in Lincoln Park would have been more than what David was asking for this whole place. David kept talking, waving his hand toward the back bedroom. "You see, this one very quiet, not street side," he said, already opening the door wider. I followed him, and he stood aside, letting me look in. The window was open, curtains fluttering in the evening breeze. The closet door was cracked, shoes neatly lined up. The bed was unmade, but otherwise the room was tidy. There was a suitcase on the floor, half packed. The whole place felt like someone had just stepped out for groceries. David stood closer than before, blocking most of the light from the hallway. He pointed to the closet, telling me it had lots of storage, then stepped back to stand between me and the door. "You check window, very good for air," he said, but his tone wasn't friendly anymore. I nodded, trying to keep things casual. My heart was pounding. I glanced around for anything that looked like a weapon, just in case. I tried to think of a way to get past him. The hallway behind him was narrow, barely wide enough for two people. He kept pushing me to look at the back corner of the room, insisting I see best part of the apartment. "Come here, come see," he repeated. I edged away, pretending to be interested, while watching his hands. He was too close, too quick to step in my path if I made a run for it. I knew I needed to get out. It didn't feel like a showing anymore. It felt like he was waiting for something. Maybe someone else was coming, or maybe he was just looking for the right moment. Suddenly, my phone buzzed. I almost jumped. I fished it from my pocket and saw an incoming call, same number as the one from the Craigslist ad. For a second, I just stared at the screen, confused. David was right there next to me, watching. I answered, turning my back slightly to him. A different man's voice came through the line. "Hello, you said you'd be here at 7. I've been waiting. Where are you?" He sounded impatient but not threatening. "This is the landlord for the apartment on Halsted." I went cold. I looked at David, standing right next to me. There was no way he could be the one calling me. I mumbled, "Sorry, I think there's been a mistake. I'll call you right back." The man on the phone said, "This happens sometimes. People copy my listing. Please be careful." Then he hung up. David's face changed completely. He stepped closer, his voice suddenly flat and unfriendly. "Who was that? You know someone else coming?" he asked, watching my face. I tried to play it cool. "Just my friend, waiting for me in the car. I need to move it for street cleaning." I walked past him, forcing a tight smile. My mind was racing, but I kept moving toward the hallway, toward the front door. He hesitated for a second, then followed, still asking questions, his tone changing from fake concern to something sharper. I didn't answer. I reached the front door and opened it, acting like I was in a rush. "Thanks for showing me the place. I'll let you know," I said quickly, already in the hallway. He didn't smile. He stepped after me, trying to keep up. I moved fast down the stairs, heart hammering, every footstep behind me making my skin crawl. His shoes made heavy thumps on the steps, and I could hear him breathing harder as he called after me. "Hey, wait, you come back tomorrow. Bring your friend. We talk more about rent." His voice was louder now, echoing in the stairwell, but there was no more friendliness in it. He sounded annoyed, maybe even angry. I didn't look back. I just kept moving, my shoes slipping a little on the damp tile at the bottom of the stairs. He was only a few steps behind as I pushed open the door and stepped out into the street. It was almost dark outside, streetlights flickering on. I kept walking, keys ready in my hand, not running, but not stopping either. I reached my car, climbed in, and locked the doors before even putting the key in the ignition. I glanced up and saw David standing on the steps, staring at me. He didn't wave. He just stood there, arms crossed, watching. Then he turned and went back inside without another word. I drove off, hands shaking so badly I had to pull over a block away. I called 911, telling the dispatcher what happened. She listened carefully, then told me I'd done the right thing. "We see this kind of scam a lot," she said. "They use real apartments so people feel safe, but sometimes it turns bad. Sometimes people get robbed, sometimes worse." She asked for the address and told me an officer would check it out. She also told me not to go back, not to meet anyone from an online listing alone again. I hung up and sat in the car for a long time, trying to stop shaking. I thought about what would have happened if I'd listened to David and gone further into that back room. What if someone else had been waiting? I went on the rental site, found the original listing, and flagged the fake one. I blocked David's number and deleted the messages. Later, I checked online and found stories from other people who'd had the same experience. Fake landlords, copied listings, showings that turned dangerous. Sometimes people lost deposits, sometimes their things, sometimes much more. I kept replaying the moment in my mind when the phone rang, when the real landlord's voice cut through the whole act. After that, I was careful with every apartment search. I checked every address, insisted on meeting in public places first, never went alone. I didn't tell my parents for months, embarrassed at how close I'd come to something worse than a bad rental. I finished the internship and eventually found another apartment. Expensive, loud, not in Lincoln Park, but real. That cheap listing was the best thing I never rented. If I hadn't answered that call, I might not be here to write about it. Last month, we had a thunderstorm that rolled in just before midnight. I was working from home, sitting at my computer in the small cottage I got from my grandmother. The rain was coming down hard outside, and the windows rattled with each burst of wind. I remember staring at my monitor, trying to finish a logo for a client who kept sending revision after revision. It was already late, but I needed the money, so I kept working. The room was lit up by my desk lamp and the blue-white glow of the screen. The rest of the house was dark, except for the kitchen light I always left on. I could hear the ticking of the old clock on the wall, mixed with the steady sound of water hitting the roof. The cottage sits at the end of a narrow street. The neighbors on either side are older, quiet people who keep their curtains closed after sunset. The hedges out front are overgrown, and I never see kids riding bikes or people out walking dogs. It's the kind of street where everyone keeps to themselves. When the power went out, it was sudden. My computer clicked off, the lamp snapped dark, and all I could hear for a second was the storm. I waited, thinking maybe it would flicker back on, but nothing happened. I got up, pulled the curtains aside, and looked out into the night. The other houses still had their porch lights burning, yellow and steady. It was just me in the dark. I grabbed the small flashlight I keep in my desk drawer and made my way through the kitchen, careful not to bump my shin on the old wooden table. The basement door creaks when you open it, and the steps down are narrow, made of rough boards that flex under your weight. I moved slowly, the beam of the flashlight bouncing over the walls and stacks of boxes. The air was cool and smelled like damp earth and rust. The electrical panel is mounted on the far wall, just past the broken washing machine and a pile of empty paint cans. When I got to the panel, I could see right away that the main breaker had been flipped to the off position. The lever was straight down, and I knew I hadn't touched it. There wasn't any sign of water leaking or wires hanging loose. The labels on the fuses were written in my grandmother's handwriting, faded but still clear. I stood there for a minute, listening to the sound of rain above, and then switched the breaker back on. The lights upstairs flickered, and I could hear the refrigerator start to hum again. I made my way back up, feeling a little unsettled but mostly annoyed. I figured maybe the storm had caused a surge or something. I went back to my office and turned the computer on, saving my work every few minutes just in case it happened again. The rest of the day was uneventful. The rain finally stopped, and the light outside turned pale blue as evening came. I finished the client project and sent the files by email just after 7. I reheated leftovers for dinner and watched some video clips on my phone. Around 9 p.m., I went back to my office to start another job. It was quiet outside, the kind of quiet where you can hear every sound in the house. I was about halfway through sketching when I heard a faint scratching noise. It was coming from somewhere below my feet, in the area under the office. The sound was light, almost like a mouse or something moving in the walls. The cottage is old, and I figured maybe rodents had found a way in, so I ignored it and kept working. A few minutes later, the noise stopped. I checked my messages, answered a couple emails, and then the house went completely dark again. This time, there was no storm. The air was still, and the sky outside the window was clear. I could see porch lights on next door, and the street lamp at the corner was working. It was only my house. I reached for my flashlight, which was still sitting on my desk, and stood up. I walked through the living room, hearing the boards creak under my feet, and went back to the basement door. I was more annoyed than worried, thinking maybe the panel was faulty. The flashlight's beam bounced off the narrow stairway as I went down. When I got to the electrical panel, I saw right away that the main breaker had been switched off again. Same as before, the lever was down. But this time, something else caught my eye. On the dusty floor in front of the panel, there was a small, dark footprint. It looked fresh, pressed into the thin layer of dust that always settles down there. I froze, holding the flashlight steady, and looked closer. The print was small, maybe the size of my palm, and I could make out the pattern of a shoe tread. It wasn't mine. I stood perfectly still, listening for any movement in the basement. But the only sound was the low hum of the refrigerator upstairs, which had kicked back on after I flipped the breaker. I didn't move. I just stared at that single footprint, realizing for the first time that someone else might be in the house. There were more prints than just the one near the panel. The light from my flashlight showed a line of wet, dark shapes across the old concrete floor, starting by the basement window and leading right up to where I was standing. The smell of damp earth and old mud was stronger now, like whoever had come in had been walking through wet grass or a puddle before crawling through the opening. The boots made a rough pattern, wide treads pressed deep into the dust. I followed the prints with the beam, feeling my heart thump in my ears. The basement window was half open, the latch twisted and bent out of shape. I knew for sure I had locked it weeks ago, the same way I did every night. Under the window, there was a pile of cardboard boxes. I used them for old files and things I never wanted to throw away. They were stacked high, 2 boxes pressed flat, another tipped on its side, and on the top one, I saw a muddy boot mark, the shape of the heel and the toe clear as day. The whole stack looked unsteady, like someone had stepped down hard. The boxes weren't in that spot the day before. Someone had moved them to use as steps, then forced the window open and climbed inside. I swept the flashlight beam around the rest of the basement, half expecting to see someone pressed into the shadows between the furnace and the storage shelves. The air was heavy and still. My breath came out short and loud. I couldn't hear anything but the low whir of the refrigerator and the faint drip of water somewhere near the back wall. No one answered when I called out, but I wasn't sure I would have heard them over the pounding in my chest. I slowly started backing away from the prints, aiming the light toward the stairs. I was careful not to turn my back on the basement as I moved, watching for any sudden motion in the corners. When I got to the first step, I put my hand on the railing, bracing myself. I took the steps 2 at a time, moving as quietly as I could manage, afraid to make noise but more afraid of staying in the dark any longer. At the top of the stairs, I paused, listening. The house was silent. I could see the thin strip of streetlight through the kitchen window. I didn't stop to search the house. I set the flashlight down on the counter, picked up my car keys and my purse, and walked straight out the front door. The porch light was still out, but I didn't care. I locked the door behind me, hands shaking, and went straight to my car, parked a few feet from the front steps. I got in, slammed the door, and hit the lock button. The engine ticked over, and my headlights washed over the empty street. I sat there gripping the steering wheel, watching my house through the windshield. I kept expecting to see someone come to the window, a shadow or a shape moving from room to room. Nothing happened. The cottage stayed dark and silent, as if no one was inside. My phone sat in the cup holder, and after a minute I picked it up and dialed the police. I tried to keep my voice steady while I explained the situation, gave my address, told them what I'd seen. The dispatcher told me to stay in my car with the doors locked. I watched the windows of my house while I waited, every second stretching longer than the last. It took less than 10 minutes for the patrol car to arrive. 2 officers stepped out, flashlights already in hand. They asked me to stay put while they went inside. I watched as they moved from room to room, beams of light sweeping across the old lace curtains and the hallway wall. I saw them open the back door, then the basement door. For a few minutes, I couldn't see anything at all. Then the officers came back outside, one of them shaking his head. They told me the house was empty. They'd checked every room, every closet, and the attic hatch. No one was there. But the basement window had definitely been forced open. The lock was bent, and there were fresh scratch marks on the frame where someone had pried it loose with a tool. They found the muddy footprints on the boxes, just like I'd described. The officers told me that break-ins through basement windows had been happening all over the neighborhood for the past couple months. The thieves would watch a house, wait for the right moment, and slip inside when no one was looking. Sometimes they would just take whatever they could carry, but other times they would wait for the homeowner to leave or go to sleep before moving through the rooms. One officer said, "You did the right thing. Don't ever confront someone you think might be inside." They took down my statement, asked if I had noticed anything missing, and gave me a card with a case number on it. After they left, I sat in the car a little longer, watching the windows. Still, nothing moved. I finally went back inside with the flashlight, keeping every light on as I walked from room to room. The next day, I called a locksmith and had every ground-level window reinforced with better locks. I bought a security system with motion sensors and cameras for the doors and basement. Every night before I go to bed, I check each window and door twice, making sure everything is secure. I still wake up sometimes when I hear a noise in the house, or if the wind rattles the siding. I lie there listening, waiting to hear footsteps on the floor above or below. Sometimes I remember the line of wet footprints on the basement floor, how close someone had come to where I sat working, completely unaware. It's not the movies or the stories that keep me up now. It's the quiet thought that someone real, someone patient and careful, watched me from the shadows and waited for the right moment. That's the part I can't shake. Even after all the locks and alarms, I still check the corners of every room, just to be sure I'm really alone. Last fall, I took some time off work after things got really stressful, and decided a solo camping trip would help me clear my head. I picked a state park I'd camped at a few times before, a place about 2 hours from where I live. My plan was 3 days, 2 nights. Just hiking, sleeping by the lake, cooking simple food, and not worrying about anything, I've always liked solo camping because there's no need to compromise. You just wake up when you want, hike as far as you feel like, and there's no pressure to entertain anyone. Plus, by now, I knew how to pick out a decent campsite, how to keep raccoons out of my food, and which trails were worth exploring. I'd even spent a couple nights alone there the year before, so nothing about it felt risky. I got there on a Thursday, mid-morning. There weren't many cars in the main lot, which made sense for a weekday in October. The air felt colder than I expected, but the sky was clear and the trees were just starting to turn. I took my time picking a spot, maybe 50 yards from the lake and a short walk from the bathrooms. It was close enough to see the water through the trees, but far enough from other campsites that I had real privacy. There was a picnic table with initials carved into the wood, and the fire ring was still full of ash from whoever had used it last. I set up my tent, rolled out my sleeping pad, and left my bag inside, then took a short walk around the lake to stretch my legs. That first day was as normal as it gets. I walked a few of the main trails, stopped at a little overlook, and made myself lunch. Just bread and cheese, nothing fancy. Saw a few other people, mostly older couples walking their dogs or retirees with binoculars. In the afternoon, I read for a while at the picnic table. The air was cool, but when the sun came out, it was warm enough to take my jacket off. That night, I made a small fire, boiled some ramen, and turned in early. The forest was quiet except for the sound of water and a few distant voices, and I actually slept better than I had in weeks. The next morning, I woke up just after sunrise, took my time making coffee, and spent most of the morning hiking the longer loop trail that circled around to the other side of the lake. It was nice, but my feet were a little sore, so I came back early to rest. I ate some trail mix and watched a couple squirrels fighting over something near a stump. Around noon, I started noticing a few new campers setting up in other spots, mostly families with kids, and figured the weekenders were arriving. Nothing unusual about that, but I noticed I felt a bit less relaxed with more people around, like there was a little less space to myself. Sometime after lunch, I was cleaning up at my site when a guy walked up and gave a casual wave. He looked about my age or a bit older, maybe mid-30s. He wore a baseball cap and hiking boots, and carried a nice backpack, the kind you see in outdoor magazines. His gear looked clean but well used. He introduced himself as Rick. He said he was passing through, had camped in this park before, and liked to hike the less popular trails. I didn't think anything of it at first. Plenty of people in parks make conversation. He asked if I'd had any luck spotting wildlife, and told me he'd seen a few deer near the old service road that morning. His knowledge of the area was clear, and he listed a couple of smaller trails I'd never heard of. He seemed easy to talk to, just friendly and relaxed, and I figured there's no harm in making some small talk. Rick said he liked to bring a little stove and cook his own meals, and asked if I'd mind if he joined me for lunch. I didn't really see a reason to refuse, so I said sure. It's always a bit easier to share the chores with someone else, and having another person around for a hike can be safer, especially if you end up on rougher ground. We ate together at my site, and Rick told a few stories about run-ins with raccoons, some near misses with thunderstorms, that kind of thing. He seemed to know what he was doing. After eating, he suggested we walk a couple of the main trails, and I agreed. It felt like a good way to spend the afternoon, and I figured I'd pick up some tips on the local wildlife from him. We set out with our day packs, taking an established trail that wound through a patch of tall pines. Rick pointed out some animal tracks in the soft dirt, said they were probably foxes. He knew a lot about edible plants, and at one point stopped to show me some wild ginger growing by a rotting log. We passed a couple hikers going the other way, exchanged nods, then didn't see anyone for a while. Rick was full of stories, about a time he got caught out after dark and had to bushwhack his way back, and another where he'd nearly stepped on a rattlesnake. He seemed genuinely interested in the outdoors and mentioned he used to hike in national parks out west before moving back east. When we got back to my campsite, we both agreed we'd worked up a good appetite. We cooked dinner together using my camp stove. Rick offered to share some of his food, rice and beans mixed with some canned chicken. He had one of those compact, high-end cooking kits and seemed comfortable using it. We ate at the picnic table, still swapping stories. He pointed out a barred owl calling from somewhere across the lake as the sun started to set. It was a good meal. By now, I'd gotten used to his presence, and it was just nice having someone to talk to after hours of being alone. After dinner, I started to clean up while Rick poured himself a cup of instant coffee. He glanced at the sky, which was still blue but growing darker at the edges, and said, "You know, there's a spot not far from here that most people miss. You can see the whole valley from up there." He said it wasn't on any map, just a viewpoint he'd found years ago. Rick said, "Takes maybe 30 minutes tops. Sunset from there is really something." He seemed genuinely eager to show it off, and I figured I had plenty of time before dark. The idea of seeing a hidden spot was tempting. Rick assured me he'd guided people up there before and it was easy to get back. I hesitated for a second, just out of habit, but Rick seemed to know the trails better than I did, so I grabbed my jacket and a flashlight, locked my car, and set off after him as we left the campsite behind. Rick led the way off the marked path, brushing aside ferns and ducking under low branches. The forest was thick here, and the ground felt uneven, soft with old leaves and hidden roots. He walked quickly, as if he knew every inch of the place. At first, I tried to pay attention to landmarks, an odd boulder, a twisted pine. But after a while, everything started to look the same in the low light. The air felt damp, and the smell of earth and old wood was strong. We crossed a dry creek bed, climbed a small ridge, and then followed a game trail that was barely visible, just the faint impression of hooves and the occasional trampled grass. Rick stopped every few minutes, looking around or checking a small compass he kept clipped to his pack. "Almost there," he said, but the sky had already gone from orange to gray, and I was starting to worry about getting back in the dark. After what felt like much longer than half an hour, the woods opened up into a clearing. The light was nearly gone, and I could see an old cabin at the far edge. It was falling apart, the roof slumped under the weight of thick moss, and the windows were smashed out, their frames leaning crooked in the walls. The door hung loose on its hinges. Rick slowed as we approached, suddenly quiet, his eyes darting around the clearing. He didn't say anything for a moment, just stared at the building. Then I noticed faint voices, low, muffled talking, coming from inside the cabin. At first I thought maybe someone else was camping up here, but the sound didn't match the relaxed energy of people hanging out. It was tense, clipped, words I couldn't make out. Rick's posture changed completely. He stood straighter, stopped smiling, and looked back at me with a face I didn't recognize. We paused at the tree line, listening. The voices inside got louder. It was clear there were at least 2 men, maybe more. I could hear the scrape of something heavy being dragged across the floor, the clatter of metal against wood, and then a sharp burst of laughter. Rick pulled out his phone, the screen lighting his face, and typed quickly with one hand. I watched as he hit send, slipped the phone back into his jacket, and finally looked me in the eye. The easygoing, chatty hiker was gone. His face was flat, his jaw tight, and his eyes flickered over me in a way that made my skin crawl. I realized how little I knew about him. The forest was quiet now, except for the voices in the cabin and the slow creak of a branch overhead. I told Rick I'd forgotten something important at my camp, tried to keep my voice steady. He didn't smile, didn't answer, just shifted his stance and stepped sideways, planting himself between me and the trail we'd come up. Everything about his posture told me I wasn't leaving. I looked around for another path, but the undergrowth was thick and the light was fading fast. Rick kept glancing at the cabin, then back at me, as if waiting for something. My heart was pounding. I heard someone inside call out, and the voices at the door grew closer. I had one chance. Before Rick could react, I turned and bolted into the woods, pushing through the brush, not caring about the thorns or branches slapping my arms. I heard Rick yell something, short, urgent, followed by loud shouts from the cabin. Heavy boots crashed through the undergrowth behind me, and a man's voice bellowed out directions, the words muffled but furious. The woods ahead were pitch dark. I had no idea where I was going, just kept moving downhill, tripping over roots, slipping in the mud, grabbing trees to keep from falling. The forest seemed endless. Every noise made me jump. Snapping branches, a bird taking off, the echo of footsteps. I could hear them behind me, men crashing through the woods, calling to each other. I doubled back, climbed over a rotten log, nearly slipped into a shallow ravine, then pressed on, heart in my throat. At one point, I stopped to listen and realized I couldn't hear anyone, but I didn't trust it. I ran again, heading for where I thought the lake should be, looking for any sign of the trail or the water through the trees. It felt like hours before I saw the faint reflection of light on water and realized I was close to camp. The sky was just starting to lighten, a cold, pale blue that let me see the outlines of my gear in the clearing. My tent had been slashed open, the fabric cut through from top to bottom. My backpack was gone, and with it my wallet, phone, and ID. The food bag was missing. Everything else had been dumped and trampled. I grabbed what little remained, my jacket, a battered first aid kit, an empty water bottle, and headed straight for the main path. I didn't stop to check the damage or look around, just walked as fast as I could, watching every shadow in case someone was still following me. I reached the ranger station around mid-morning, shaking, dirty, my clothes torn and scratched from the run through the woods. I tried to explain what had happened. The ranger on duty listened, his face tense, and took down everything I said. He told me I wasn't the first person to report something strange up there, but that every time they sent someone to look, the old cabin was gone. No sign, no structure, not even footprints. My report would be added to the file. The ranger warned me to stay on established trails in the future and said he was sorry about my gear, but there was little else he could do. That was it. I left the park that afternoon, still shaken. After that trip, I never went camping alone again. The sense of safety I'd always felt in the woods was gone for good. When I first moved to Oregon for my new job, I had to get everything for my apartment pretty much from scratch. I didn't have much extra cash after all the moving expenses, so I started looking for furniture deals online, mostly on Craigslist and Facebook Marketplace. I saw a post for a set of bookshelves, real wood, tall, nothing fancy but solid, for $30, which seemed way too good to ignore. There was only one photo, kind of grainy, but you could tell they were in good shape. I messaged the seller, a guy named Dave, and he wrote back almost instantly. He said the shelves were still available, but there was one thing. He could only meet on weekdays after 10 at night. He explained he worked a night shift at a factory in town, so his schedule was weird, and he usually slept during the day. I hesitated for a minute, but I thought about my empty living room and how I was tired of stacking books on the floor. I told him that worked for me and asked for the address. He texted back right away, sent me the location and a long, detailed set of directions, way more than I needed with GPS. He seemed in a hurry. His texts were all crammed together, no punctuation, like he just wanted to get it over with. I figured maybe he just didn't like texting. I waited until about 9:45, then messaged again to confirm I was coming. He answered almost immediately. Yeah, see you soon. Just knock when you get here. And I headed out. It was a Tuesday night, and the area he gave me was about 20 minutes outside downtown. I hadn't really been to that part of the city before. When I got closer, the houses looked rough. Lots of cars up on blocks, yards full of junk, faded Christmas lights still hanging from porches. The streetlights weren't working on most of the road, so it felt even darker than it should have. I double-checked the address and drove real slow until I found the house. There was a rusted-out truck parked in the grass, the headlights pointed at the street like they hadn't worked in years. I pulled up along the curb, engine running, and just sat for a second, looking at the place. The house looked abandoned from the outside. Car parts were everywhere. Hoods, tires, broken seats, piled in the tall grass and across the cracked driveway. Paint was peeling off the wood siding, and a couple of windows had big boards nailed over them, some painted shut, others with dirty towels stuck in the gaps. The porch light was on but dim, barely cutting through the darkness. I got out of my car, feeling the crunch of broken glass under my sneakers. The air smelled like burnt oil and wet leaves. The front yard had a half-rotten couch tipped over near the steps. I walked up, thinking about just turning around, but Dave must have been watching for me because he opened the door before I even reached it. He stepped out onto the porch, looked me up and down, then glanced past me at my car and down the street, like he was expecting someone else. He was probably in his late 40s, maybe 50, with stringy, greasy hair that hung in his face. He wore a dirty tank top and jeans that sagged at the knees. When he reached out to shake my hand, his grip was too tight, almost painful, and I caught the strong smell of beer and sweat. He mumbled something about, "Glad you made it," but barely looked at me. He opened the front door wider and waved me inside with his free hand, saying the shelves were just inside, in the living room. As soon as I stepped into the hallway, the door slammed shut behind us. Hard, like someone was angry, not just closing it. I jumped a little at the sound, but Dave didn't react. The inside of the house was worse than the outside. The walls were bare drywall with spots where the paint had bubbled up or been scratched away. A single bulb hung from the ceiling, no fixture, just wires twisting up into the darkness. There were piles of clothes, some old tools, and empty bottles shoved along the baseboards. The smell was stronger inside, like something had spilled and never been cleaned up. Dave kept glancing over his shoulder, his eyes flicking toward the curtained windows and the front door, then at me, like he was nervous about something but trying to hide it. He walked ahead of me, down a short hallway, his steps quick and uneven, muttering under his breath. I could hear a television from another room, but it was just static, no voices. The carpet was stained, patches missing, with dark footprints showing the only real path through the mess. I hesitated, thinking about just asking to see the shelves from the doorway, but it felt too late to back out. My hands were sweating, and my keys were still in my pocket. I told myself it was fine. Just grab the shelves, pay, and get out. Dave stopped at the entrance to the living room and looked back at me, his mouth tight, like he was waiting for me to say something. Inside the living room, it was even darker than I expected. The only light was from an old lamp with a yellowed shade sitting crooked in the corner. It barely reached the edges of the room. All around, there were boxes stacked up, some open and spilling out wires, old clothes, random bits of junk, cordless phone, broken radio, a pile of kitchen knives in a plastic tub. Nothing looked organized, more like someone had just dragged everything into the room to get it out of the way. There were dirty dishes on a folding table pushed against one wall. The carpet was stained with black marks like oil, and some of the boards creaked when I stepped further in. Dave pointed at the bookshelves, which were against the wall opposite the lamp. I saw right away they weren't like the ones in the photo, These were much rougher, with boards warped and bent, screws missing, and one side panel sagging away from the rest. It looked like someone had tried to fix them with duct tape but gave up halfway. I crouched down to look at the bottom shelf and asked if there was a way to get more light in here, maybe a ceiling light or another lamp. Dave said, "Bulbs are all dead, don't worry about it," and shrugged like it wasn't a big deal. He hovered just behind me, his hands jammed in his pockets, rocking from foot to foot. While I was bent over looking at a crack in one of the shelves, I heard footsteps coming from deeper in the house. They were heavier than Dave's, and when I looked up, another man came in through the doorway from the kitchen. He was younger than Dave, maybe mid-30s, with short hair and broad shoulders. He wore a sleeveless hoodie and jeans with holes in the knees, arms crossed as he stepped into the light. He didn't say anything, just looked at me, expression flat. Dave didn't even introduce him or act surprised, like he'd been waiting for him to show up. The second guy stood near the hallway entrance and just stared. For a second, I thought maybe he lived there too, but it didn't feel right. I stood up, suddenly aware that I was boxed in on two sides. The window behind me was covered with a thick curtain, and the only open space was toward the front hall. Dave kept talking about how these shelves are real solid. You just have to tighten a few bolts. Easy fix. But his voice was strained now, fake, cheerful. The younger man stayed silent, moving closer to the wall beside the door. They were both standing in a way that made it hard for me to get back to the front of the house without squeezing past. The mood had changed. I realized there was no way this was a normal furniture sale anymore. I started edging sideways, my heart pounding, not really listening to Dave's rambling. I glanced toward the front door, calculating the fastest way out. Dave cut off his own story and looked right at me. "You brought cash, right? Like we talked about?" He was still trying to smile, but his mouth didn't move. The second guy uncrossed his arms and shifted his weight, and that's when I noticed the handle of a knife sticking out of his back pocket. He turned his body just enough so it was visible, not even trying to hide it. My throat went dry. I shook my head and said, "No, I need to go. I'm not buying these, sorry." I tried to keep my voice calm, but it was too quiet. Dave stepped in front of the hallway, blocking the path. His face went cold, all the fake friendliness gone. "You can't just come in here and waste our time," he said, and his tone was harder now. The younger guy moved closer behind me, hands clenched at his sides. I realized then that if I didn't do something right now, I probably wasn't leaving that house with anything. The way they stood, blocking me in, no small talk, no mention of the shelves anymore, made it clear they'd done this before. My skin prickled. I took a step back, bumping into a box, and Dave advanced another step, crowding the space. The younger guy's eyes didn't leave my hands. I kept my eyes on the door, and then made my move. I shoved Dave as hard as I could with both arms, sending him staggering back into the wall. He hit it with a loud thud, knocking a frame off a nail and sending something crashing to the floor. I didn't stop to apologize or check if he was hurt. The younger man shouted something, his voice echoing in the hallway, but I didn't turn around. I bolted through the narrow path between the boxes, almost tripping over a pile of shoes and plastic bags, and ran straight for the front door. I could hear their footsteps behind me, the younger guy cursing as he tried to catch up. My hands were shaking so bad I could barely get the front door open on the first try. The metal latch stuck, and I fumbled with it, feeling the vibration of footsteps coming fast. I finally yanked it open and sprinted down the porch steps, not looking back. I could hear the door slam hard behind me and a voice yelling from inside, but I didn't care if they were coming after me. I ran to my car, yanked open the door, and dropped my keys twice before jamming them into the ignition. My hands wouldn't stop trembling as I started the engine. The headlights caught the shape of the house, and I saw the silhouette of Dave standing in the window, watching me. I pulled out so fast I almost clipped the mailbox. My breathing was ragged, and it felt like hours before I was even out of the neighborhood. I didn't slow down until I was back on the main road, and even then, I kept glancing at my rearview mirror expecting to see their headlights behind me. The rest of that night, I kept replaying every detail. How the two of them boxed me in, the knife, the way Dave's attitude changed in an instant. I never responded to another late-night furniture listing again, no matter how desperate I was for a deal. Looking back, I know now the whole setup was a trap. They probably used those listings to lure people in who needed cheap furniture, waited until someone came alone with cash, and then robbed them. Or worse. The boarded windows, the broken lights, the way Dave watched for my car. Everything about that night was set up so no one could see or hear what was happening inside. I got lucky because I didn't ignore the warning signs, and I trusted my gut when it told me to get out. I still drive past that street sometimes on my way home from work, but I never look at that house. I don't want to know what else went on behind those doors. I rented the apartment because my own place was torn up from a burst pipe, and the repair company said it would be a week at least before I could come back. I didn't want to stay with friends, and the hotel prices near my work were just too high, so I found this small one-bedroom through an app. It was a few blocks away from the train station, older part of town, but the building looked all right. The listing photos made it look clean. Not much in the way of furniture, just a brown couch, a dining table with 2 chairs, a lamp by the window, and a flat mattress with plain gray sheets. The bathroom had one of those plastic curtain rods you could see was slightly bent. It smelled faintly of paint when I first walked in. The only window in the living room faced the brick wall of the neighboring building, and it didn't get much sun. There were scuff marks on the wood floor near the door, probably from people moving furniture. I set up my laptop at the little dining table, plugged in my phone, and went out for groceries. Just coffee, bread, a 6-pack, some eggs, and a couple of microwave meals. There was a laundromat on the corner and a small bodega across the street. The first night was normal enough. I stayed up late working on a report for my boss, microwaved some pasta, and scrolled my phone until I was tired. I slept light. I could hear the sound of water pipes groaning in the walls every now and then, but nothing out of the ordinary. It was actually nice to be away from my own apartment with all the fans and heaters running for the repairs. The next morning, a little after 9, I was sitting at the table on my laptop, making notes for a meeting, when there was a knock at the door. It was firm, not loud, just 2 knocks. I got up, but I didn't open the door right away. I looked through the peephole first. There was a man standing there, maybe early 30s, thin, a little taller than me, with a faded red backpack over one shoulder. He was wearing a blue hoodie, gray jeans, and cheap white sneakers, the kind with the plastic toe. His hair was dark and cut short. He looked restless. He kept glancing down the hall and then back at the door, shifting his weight like he was impatient. He reached out and knocked again, this time tapping the wood a little faster. I waited, thinking maybe he had the wrong apartment. But then he leaned in toward the door, put his hand against it, and called out, "Hey, is Mike here? I'm looking for Mike." He said it kind of fast, voice tight, like he was in a hurry. I didn't answer. I didn't know a Mike. I hadn't met anyone in the building except the guy from the management company who gave me the key, and he didn't mention anyone stopping by. The man knocked again, louder. I heard him sigh. Then he muttered something to himself and stepped away, but only a few feet. He just stood there in the hallway, looking up and down, fidgeting with his backpack strap. I watched him through the peephole. He pulled out his phone, tapped it, put it back, and knocked again, this time with the side of his fist. I stayed quiet, watching. He seemed more frustrated. Then I saw him glance right at the peephole, maybe realizing someone was watching. I stepped back, heart thumping. He stood there another minute or two, muttering under his breath, and finally walked off down the hall. I waited another minute before looking out again. He was gone. I locked the deadbolt and checked the handle. I thought maybe it was a mix-up, wrong apartment, or he was looking for someone who used to live there. But there was something about how he kept looking around, and the way he pressed up against the door, that put me on edge. I tried to get back to work, but I found myself glancing at the door every time the pipes made a noise or the floorboards creaked. I double-checked the window lock and moved my bag closer to my chair. The rest of the morning, nothing happened. I joined a couple of video calls, tried to focus on my work, typed out some emails for the team. Around noon, I made a sandwich and kept the TV on low in the background. It stayed quiet all afternoon. I finished a big part of my project, no one disturbed me, and for a few hours, it almost felt normal. I texted a friend about maybe meeting up later in the week, but didn't mention the guy at the door. I figured if he was really looking for someone who used to live there, he'd figure it out and stop coming back. After I logged off work, I microwaved some dinner, checked the news, and then stretched out on the couch for a while. It was about 6 p.m., still light outside, when I heard knocking again. This time it was harder, not just a couple of knocks. He was pounding on the door, then pausing, then pounding again. I stood up, feeling my chest tighten. I walked up and looked through the peephole. Same guy as before. The red backpack, the blue hoodie, the same restless look. He was leaning in closer to the door, face flushed, hair a little damp like he'd been walking fast. "Hey, I know you're in there," he said, voice raised but not yelling. He knocked again, even harder. "I just need to get my stuff. Mike said he'd leave it here. Come on, man, just open up. I won't take long." I didn't move. I barely breathed. He looked around the hallway like he was checking if anyone was coming, then leaned closer. "I know you're inside. I saw the lights. Look, I'm not trying to mess with you. I just need to get my stuff from Mike. He said he left it in the closet or something." He was getting more agitated, tapping his foot, knocking every few seconds. I heard him mutter something that sounded frustrated. Then he raised his voice again. "Seriously, I'm not leaving until you open up." I backed away from the door, picked up my phone, and thought about calling the building manager, but I hesitated. I figured maybe if I just waited him out, he'd get bored and leave. I didn't answer. For 10 minutes he stayed there, knocking every so often, sometimes just standing silent. Once or twice, I heard him breathing right against the door. Eventually, I heard his footsteps walk away. Then nothing. I waited a few more minutes before looking out the peephole again. The hallway was empty. I sat back down at my desk, the light outside starting to fade. I figured if I ignored him, maybe he'd stop coming back. But I kept listening for any sounds in the hallway, half expecting the knocking to start again. Later that evening, I was at the small table, catching up on emails and trying to unwind. I had the TV on low, but all my attention was on my laptop. The apartment was still and quiet, just the hum from the fridge and sometimes a distant sound from the street. Around 9, I heard a noise, something light at first, like the creak of floorboards. At first, I thought it was from the hallway, or maybe the pipes again. Then there was a scraping noise, like someone dragging something across a hard surface. I paused my typing and listened. The sound wasn't coming from the hallway. It was inside the apartment, and it wasn't the TV or my own movement. I got up and flipped on every light, starting in the living room and then the short hallway toward the bathroom and kitchen. There were muddy boot prints in the hallway that hadn't been there earlier, smears of wet dirt leading from the kitchen toward the bathroom door. The trail started right under the kitchen window, which I now saw was open an inch, though I knew I had closed and locked it after making dinner. I stared at the scuff marks on the windowsill and the edge of the counter. Outside the window, the rusty fire escape railing was flecked with wet dirt and a single partial footprint. My breath got shallow. Someone had come in through the fire escape while I was sitting at the table. The boot prints were still glistening a little, leaving a dirty streak across the cheap tile. My heart started pounding, and I realized the intruder could still be inside, maybe in the bathroom or hiding somewhere out of sight. I held my phone tight and backed slowly toward the front door, trying not to make any noise. I reached for the deadbolt, planning to step out and call for help, but before I could touch it, the bathroom door opened with a slow, deliberate creak. The man from earlier, same blue hoodie, same red backpack, stepped out, nearly bumping right into me. For a split second, we just stared at each other, both frozen and unsure what would happen next. His eyes were wide, startled, maybe even afraid. He looked older than I thought, with lines on his face and dirt smudged on his cheek. We didn't speak. He shifted his weight like he was about to say something, then turned and made for the kitchen window again. I instinctively raised my phone and snapped a photo, the flash lighting up the room for a half second. He turned back, saw me blocking his way to the door, and pushed past me roughly. His shoulder slammed into mine, knocking me against the wall, and then he yanked the door open and ran down the stairwell. I heard his boots hitting the steps, echoing through the old building, and then the front entrance downstairs slammed shut. I stood in the entryway for a few seconds, my body tense and shaking, before I remembered to lock the door behind him. The muddy footprints, the open window, and the fading sound of his flight all seemed unreal. I grabbed my phone and dialed 911, still breathing hard, and when the operator answered, I told them everything as clearly as I could. The police came about 20 minutes later. I let them in and showed them the photo I'd managed to take. Blurry, but clear enough to see his face and the red backpack. The officers took pictures of the muddy prints in the window. The detective who came with them recognized the man right away. He told me they'd been looking for him for a while. This guy targeted short-term rentals, especially places rented through apps. His method was to knock on doors, pretend to be looking for someone, and watch for apartments with new tenants or people who didn't answer. If he thought the occupant was alone or unfamiliar with the building, he'd come back later and break in, usually through a window or fire escape. I found out that he had robbed a string of rentals all over the city. Most times he got away with electronics, cash, sometimes even bags or shoes. A lot of his victims never saw his face. The detective said my photo was the clearest evidence they'd gotten so far. 2 days later, they called me and said he had been arrested breaking into another apartment on the other side of town. Someone else had reported a suspicious person knocking on doors, and the patrol officers had arrived just as he was climbing in through a ground floor window. After that, I spent the rest of my stay in the rental checking the locks at least 3 times before going to sleep. Even now, whenever I book a short-term rental, I ask about the security and always check the windows, fire escapes, and deadbolts myself. It's not something you think about until it happens, but once it does, you never really stop.